and I've been asked, and I'm privileged and honoured to be asked, to host today, tomorrow, and Wednesday as we try and tangle with one of the most important issues challenging the nation's future and the economy, and particularly the higher education sector, which is how to merge business and the academy. It's an absolutely crucial issue, and we've got some wonderful people joining us from both politics, from other parts of government, from universities, and of course from business and investors as well. It should be fascinating. Looking forward to your contributions throughout the sessions as well. Before we start though, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you and hosting this from the land of the Bunurong Bunurong people and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And also I'd like to express my personal impatience for a treaty or treaties in order to try to repair just some of the damage that's been caused in the past. Having got that out of the way, there's a very generous session timetable. We've got a break, so you can go off and get that essential opportunity to recaffeinate or get some tea or whatever is your particular brand of poison, and also something to eat during the course of both today, tomorrow, and Wednesday. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, a pre-recorded address from the federal government minister in Scott Morrison's coalition government. Alan Tudge formerly has the title now of the Minister for Education and Youth. Tomorrow we'll hear from the Shadow Minister, Richard Marles, and on Wednesday at the same time, we'll hear from Christopher Pyne, a coalition senior minister and Liberal Party insider over many years, and perhaps the most engaging and amusing member of the Parliament for as long as I can just about remember. But without any further delay, let's hear from Alan Tudge, the Minister. Thank you, Minister.
Well, good morning and thanks for having me at your summit today. And can I say at the outset, just a congratulations to Ian Martin for taking on the leadership of the Australian Technology Network of Universities, and in the same breath say a very big thank you and well done to Attila Brunj as well for his leadership in terms of over the last little while as well. I'm a big fan of the Australian Technology Network of Universities, not just because 2 of the 5 are in my home city of Melbourne, or my home state of Victoria at least, but equally because I think you're amongst the most innovative of all of the universities in terms of what you do, and particularly your engagement with industry, which is so important and largely what I want to speak about today. Let me at the start though, just say something briefly about international students, because I know with the borders being closed, that has caused disruptions to the sector, to universities, to the broader community, because we haven't been able to get new international students in. I can't provide any firm guarantees as to when we're going to have large numbers back. I had said a few weeks ago that I'd hoped and increasingly hoped that larger numbers would be back by early next year. It still remains my hope that we'll get there, but I just can't guarantee this, and we're obviously watching this space very carefully. We provided a fair bit of assistance to the university sector last year to help you manage the transition and deal with some of the financial challenges which you are facing because of fewer international students. And we're certainly keeping a close eye on the university finances in that regard. I have been looking at the numbers, and I've got to say that I'm quite pleased that the numbers aren't nearly as bad as what we perhaps thought that they would be at this stage, but we are keeping a close eye on it, and I just do want to acknowledge the situation that you're in. The main message that I wanted to give today though is around how our universities generally can collaborate and work more closely with industry, and I know that's a big focus of this conference. And generally the Australian Technology Network universities are very good at this. There's 2 ways that this can occur. I'll just briefly touch on the first, but I really want to focus on the second. The first being that it can occur through the courses that we provide and the interaction and the collaboration that you have with industry in terms of the design of the courses, the placements which you have, and the ongoing learning, so that when a person graduates from your universities, they are fully skilled up to be able to get jobs at the other end. I've certainly been influenced by my discussions with people like Attila and Ian and others who have been thinking deeply about this, and I plan on doing some more policy work in this space and working closely with you as to how we will do that. The main goal, though, of mine, my number one priority, and certainly one of the priorities for the government as a whole, is how we can get better research commercialisation. How we can take some of our world-leading primary research and move it down the scale and actually get greater commercial outcomes at the other end. Because when you look at the data, which I have pretty closely now, you can see that we punch above our weight in terms of research. The number of publications, the quality of those publications, but we don't punch above our weight in relation to research commercialisation. In fact, on most metrics, we're far below where we should be. I also look at what the growth has been in research and the output over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, universities collectively produced 23,000 publications from about just under $3 billion of research funding. Today, we spend about $12.5 billion on research funding and produce 100,000 publications per annum. My question, though, is have we got the commensurate impact on our society from that massive increase in publications and research investment that we've had? Now, I think that we already have, as I said, incredible primary research which we've done. We've got remarkably good practices, examples across the sector of where great research commercialisation has occurred, but in aggregate, we can do more, and we want to do more, and we want to do as well as some of the leading countries do. Because we've got great challenges which we need to solve. We've got great new industries that we want to be creating in the future. And to do that, we need the very best minds put to task. And many of the greatest minds in our country reside in our public universities. And it's not just the commercialisation for the sake of commercialisation, but of course, when you do that, you get products out to market and you make a massive difference on people's lives. I often think about the example of Cochlear, one of our most celebrated examples of research commercialisation. That research would not nearly have had the same impact on society, on the world, had it not been commercialised, such that now, from memory, I think it's something like 500 million people have benefited from that research technology and assisting with people's hearing. But equally, there's other social challenges which need to be made as well, which need to be addressed. And some of those social challenges, I think we could benefit from the university sector tackling them more. Now, many of those big social challenges do involve cross-disciplinary teams, and as one university vice-chancellor said to me, they don't necessarily involve getting published in the world's leading journals, but they're nevertheless critically important. So it's something else that we need to be thinking about, and I want to work on with you over the next 6 to 12 months. But when it comes down to it, this is certainly my number one agenda, is how we can get greater research commercialisation, how we can overcome the valley of death from the primary research to the full application. And we've got a team which is working on that at the moment. We're listening very closely to what your submissions are to our task force, and we want to make a big difference in this space and really shift the dial. So thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for all the work which you do in teaching students, in your engagement already with industry. Thank you for the research which you do, and to the university leaders there, thank you for your leadership. We've got a big task ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to working closely with you as we go about fulfilling it.
Thank you, Minister. That's the Minister for Education and Youth, Alan Tudge, in Scott Morrison's coalition government. Shortly, we'll have our first panel where we're going to be looking at big business and finance-driven incentives with two very well-positioned experts in the field. Inez Willocks will be joining us as a commentator together with Matt Linden from Industry Super and our lead panelist from UTS Innovation, Professor Roy Green. That's coming up after a short break. But just before we get there, Luke Shee is the boss of ATN and he's going to join me just for a quick analysis, I suppose is the best word, of what we've just heard from the Minister. And Luke, thank you very much for joining us for the first time and first of many occasions where we get to pick your brains. The Minister talked there about his highest priority being to try and improve the impact that commercialisation from universities has on the community, on society and on the economy. How do you define impact, or how do you think he defines impact?
Well, firstly, thanks, John, and thanks for being our MC over the next 3 days. We're delighted that you're participating and leading those discussions and helping facilitate what we hope will be really great nuggets of gold and interest from both business, universities, of course, and our partners in government. I think it's a really interesting thing. At ATN universities, we've prided ourselves since, the 19th century when some of our institutions were first created, on linking people with the world of work and linking industries with the skilled workforce they need. So there's a long tradition of more than 100 years. If you think about the University of South Australia and RMIT in particular in that space. And I think it's a constantly evolving thing that we make sure that we have people that have the skills they need for the future of work, and of course that we work with industry. And since our universities received university status over the last 50 years, we've worked tirelessly to ensure that we're making opportunities of our knowledge that transfers into businesses. And particularly at the ATN, we're really proud of our links with small to medium enterprise. So to answer your question, I think research with impact is really important. It's important not just the ultimate aim, which is commercializing an idea, but it's the transfer of knowledge between universities and businesses and that entrepreneurial lens that's really important. And one thing I think is really excellent across our universities, the 5 universities, and of course our partners at the University of Newcastle who are joining us with this summit, is we have nearly 300,000 students, and so many of them are the entrepreneurs of the future. And it's students with that youthful energy and exuberance and passion and new creative ideas that will apply the knowledge that they get at universities and take it to the marketplace and create what we hope to be new business opportunities. And of course, that will mean more jobs for Australians.
Did the Minister give us a hint there? He said he's looking forward to doing more policy work in the future, and then he talked about designing courses. Is that the sort of thing where he's going to be looking to improve right back at design stage of an entire course? The input that industry has in commercialising, it comes in at the beginning rather than added on, tacked on at the end?
Well, I think, John, that's a really amazing point, isn't it? You can't just add innovation on as a buzzword. It has to be enshrined and embedded into what universities do, but it also has to be embedded within the culture of our corporate world. And I look forward to the next session where we'll hear about what are some of the impediments, but what are also some of the successes in that. And I think you're right. It's both teaching and learning, and of course, what we do in the research space, and also that knowledge transfer. I think it's tremendously important that we share capability. We have mentoring across universities and small to medium enterprise and big businesses, of course, and helping that exchange of ideas, because it's where that exchange occurs that you get the entrepreneurial lens and then the thing actually commercializes. So if it's enshrined from the very beginning, that's a wonderful thing. And of course, something we're very proud of across the ATN that we do every single day.
Okay, just one more minute and then we go to a very short break before we come back with our first big panel. I've worked 30 years for an organisation that, of course, knows nothing at all about silos, and that was the ABC. The Minister mentioned cross-disciplinary collaboration being crucial, and it's easily said, but it's hard to do. So is that one of the big challenges, how to take cross-disciplinary collaboration to the next stage?
John, I think it's in large organisations like the ABC, like universities, or our corporations and our government departments, the risk is silos. And of course, ATN being young, dynamic, engaged universities are not afraid of disruption, not afraid of new ways of doing things, have always looked at those issues. and embraced multidisciplinary approaches to research, multidisciplinary approaches to that knowledge transfer piece I've talked about, and of course, multidisciplinary programs that we teach our students. So I think we really celebrate that. And of course, if the minister wants to work with us on finding out ways to better enshrine that into what we do, better enshrine it in what business does, that's only going to be a good thing for the country.
Well, Silos now are famous for hosting artworks, so let's see what else we can do with Silos over the course of today, tomorrow and Wednesday as well. Luke, thank you, and we'll be speaking some more. There's a short break, which will be in part filled by a video from the University of South Australia, which I'm looking forward to seeing. We'll be back at 12:20 in just 5 minutes from now with our first panel on big business and finance-driven incentives. I hope you'll join us, and looking forward to seeing you on the other side of the break.
Provide scientists the ability to perform research in space.
My name's Costa Canitzelis. I'm a co-founder of Right Technologies. We're developing a tracking system for drones.
The reason to apply for this program is essentially that there's absolutely no reason not to.
I think it's a great opportunity for you to really understand your business, set the foundations for you to go out there and actually scale up.
The type of mentorship and advice and the people you meet, other startup companies as well, is just a great environment to be starting up a company here.
Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody. I'm John Fain and I'll be hosting the panel discussions that we're about to have the first of now, and then the others that follow right through the course of today, tomorrow and Wednesday for the ATN conference that we're, well, so looking forward to learning from during the course of these 3 days. Brought to you, of course, by Curtin, Deakin, RMIT, University of South Australia, UTS in Sydney and the University of Newcastle in collaboration as well. If you want the full bios of the people on each of these panels, including today, we're not going to run through exhaustively telling you how fabulous they all are. They've all been chosen right through the course of these 3 days because they have terrific expertise to offer, and more details are available online from the ATN website. So we'll save the time we got to use it as best as we can with each of them. Our lead panelist for this session on big business and finance-driven incentives is Professor Roy Green from UTS Innovation. And then we'll be joined by leading business lobbyist Inez Willocks from the AI Group and Matt Linden, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of Industry Super Australia, representing the industry super funds, you know, the ones that do that, the ones that are jointly managed by employers and employees rather than the retail sector, which is the flip side of it, but too much information. Let's get straight into it. And Roy Green, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what do you see as the biggest challenges? If you can take us through in some detail what you regard the biggest challenges as being, and then we'll get to Inez and Matt after that. Hello, Roy. I think you're muted. There we go. Try again.
I'm muted, but also no video.
Well, let's keep going, so we can sort that as we go.
Okay. Well, thank you, John, and thank you to ATN. The issue that we face in Australia is essentially that we have a commodity-based economy. We have very low levels of diversity, sometimes described as complexity. We're number 93 on the International Complexity Index, defined by the Harvard Atlas of Complexity, in between Senegal and Pakistan. And this is essentially a reflection of the lack of diversity of our export mix. As the Minister pointed out, we do have a strong performance in research, less so in commercialization. And one of the issues here is that we treat research commercialization as a linear process. There are many parts of the world that do innovation in a very different way. They collect the stakeholders, the academics, the business, government funding, and they aggregate them in specialized areas, sometimes driven by missions, and they do so in the context of structures that have continuity. Our structures don't have continuity. We have a very fragmented research and innovation system. Some of you may have seen a report I prepared for the Senate a few years ago showing that we have research and innovation spending around $10 billion spread across 13 portfolio areas. Just start my video here. Yep, there we go. We have research and innovation spending spread across 13 portfolio areas, 150 different line items. It's immense fragmentation, and governments are always very tempted to invent new programs rather than to consolidate existing ones. Those programs that have been successful, ARC linkage, CRCs, they've been successful, but only in a very narrow and limited sense. That we don't have the permanent structures that other countries have devised. The Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, the new catapult centres, well, they're still quite new in the UK, which were modelled on the Fraunhofers, the new Manufacturing USA institutes in the US, the central coordinating functions of institutions like Innovate UK, Vinnova in Sweden, Enterprise Ireland, and these are all functions that ensure and consolidate and embed collaboration between business, universities and government. And this is the position that we're potentially ready to reach in the post-COVID period. We've been through a commodity boom where our manufacturing industry has diminished somewhat because of the high dollar that was brought about by the high terms of trade. We've also been through tariff reform program, which was intended to produce smaller but more competitive SMEs in global markets and value chains. We're on the other side of all of those challenges, and we now have the potential in the post-COVID recovery to change and develop our industrial structure in the direction of a research and innovation-driven economy. And this is where all the economies of the future are positioning themselves. If we look at the EU programs, $700 million for research and innovation, Biden's new program, 400 to 500 billion, Germany, 80 billion in addition to what they're already spending, even Singapore, 20 billion. And we have a modern manufacturing strategy, which we may come to later, around 1.5 billion, quite small, but the potential is to focus that on how other countries and how we can adapt what other countries are doing in our own context to enhance our research and innovation performance. I'll leave it there, John.
Okay, and I'll come to Inez and Matt in a moment, but let me just take some of those threads and tease them out if I can. Is money the problem? Is politics the problem? Is short-termism the problem? Is it all of the above? If we can't come up with a coherent climate policy in the last decade in Australia, what chance is there that we'll have a coherent policy on innovation?
Well, it's all the above, but even with the money that we've got, we're not spending it cost effectively. As I said, we spend around 10 billion a year in research and innovation. And if we threw it all up in the air and wanted it to land somewhere, it probably wouldn't land where it does at the moment. We have very little cross-fertilization between the different departments, all of which are responsible for different aspects of our research program. We're even seeing some potential dysfunctionality in the way that research commercialization is being pursued by two separate departments, by education and by industry. And the question is, how much interaction is there going to be in the definition of any new programs, or are we going to see two sets of programs in two different departments around the same set of objectives, but pursuing them in different ways? That's bound to confuse our potential network and client base around SMEs and large companies. Those programs that have been successful, like the, well, certain of the CRCs, the one that Inez and I sit on the board of is the Innovative Manufacturing CRC, which has worked really successfully with SMEs and with large international companies. For example, a recent project with Stryker, a medtech company, global company, is going to lead to more investment in Australia since it was a very successful program. Also, the Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing Hub, all of these bodies, by the way, with very strong input from ATN universities. That body, it goes a little bit further than CRCs, more in the direction of the UK catapult type structure with its own facility, universities participating in it and providing direct services to companies, as well as connecting them up with researchers.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Roy, but let me bring Matt and first of all Inez in on these discussions. Inez, you sit on so many different boards and you have your connections so intensely through to many levels of policy making. We heard from the Minister before, he wants to shift some of the policy making here, and we're hearing from Roy that at the moment there's a bit of dysfunction. What do you see the priorities as being?
It's good to see you, John, and Matt and Roy and everyone out there. Good to talk to you all. Look, it's a system that we have in Australia that is not working and has not worked for as long as I can remember or we can remember. It varies from state to state. It varies from institution to institution. There are different business perspectives here. It's a whole range of issues and problems. But despite that, we do, John, have an enormous number of successes, but it's almost in spite of ourselves. There's a couple of points I'd sort of start with. One is that we have not had a consistent basis for R&D spend within Australia for a very long time. We've had a lot of jumping around, a lot of ad hocery here, which has been a big disincentive for business because the rules keep changing all the time. That's point one. Point two is that we have just never been able to build scale within Australian industry, and I'm happy to come back to that point, which really does put R&D, investment, commercialisation at its heart. So we've sort of missed we miss out on opportunities because we have a lot of small businesses. And what a very commonly used statistic, John, is that 90% of our industry, our manufacturing industry, employs less than 20 people. So you're just going to get really piecemeal approaches through that, unfortunately. And then you've got to find ways to incentivize that growth. And the Modern Manufacturing Fund, which Roy spoke about, small as it is now, is at least a start in the right direction. The third point, which is, I think, where the Minister has been doing a lot of work, Alan Tudge, and before him, Dan Tehan, is around commercialisation and how do universities shift their focus more and more towards the commercialisation of outputs rather than in other directions. And to do that, they need to build partnerships. So I think we're back to the point, John, where we need to find new ways to build partnerships between industry and universities. I come from the industry perspective. I sit on boards, as you said. Industry, I'll be upfront, has not been good at this on the whole, has missed opportunities, has quite often not been able to see what it's missing. And part of that comes back to scale, as I mentioned before. But we're now at a point where COVID has presented an opportunity to change mindset. Now, people like Roy and I have been talking about different models for a long time, catapult models, Fraunhofer models. We have to develop an Australian model that fits our need and our direction. But COVID has given us the opportunity to sort of rethink and reset. The point here, John, is, I'll just finish up on this, is we can't dawdle, we can't wait for long. We have to get cracking quickly because others around the world globally are as well. So this is an opportunity to reset and rethink, but we don't have long to reset or rethink either.
All right, I'll come to Matt in a moment. One more question for you first, though, Innes. It seems to be an Australian disease, this short-termism, where people are always looking for the sugar hit of the quick return, either personal career return by advancement and progress, whether it's people in business and industry or people in politics or people in academia. It's pretty much all the same across the board there. How do we get past that? And particularly, and this will link us to Matt in a moment, but I want to hear from you, Innes. Given that investors are looking for long-term returns, how do you reconcile a need for long-term returns with the obsession with short-term sugar hits?
Well, you're right, John. We do. It is a disease. It's an affliction that we have, is that we can't seem to think beyond, the political cycle, which is really where we're at 3 years. And that history has taught us to not think beyond that because there's always constant change in policy and policy approach. So we haven't had continuity. And I think, what I spend my life arguing for is as much continuity and harmonisation as possible across a whole range of policy fields. You talked about climate before. I mean, I think we've all, lived many lifetimes trying to work through the climate debate in Australia. But this is another area where if we don't get it right, we will miss the bus again. And Roy started out, one of his many points was that, well, we have had a commodity-based economy for a long time, and we haven't seemed to be able to move past that on the whole. We have had many, many successes, and we have contributed enormously, and to use a Gareth Evansism, we have punched way above our weight when it does come to innovation as a country. But we haven't been able to get that to return to commercial return for the country. So universities miss out on that. Other public institutions miss out on it, business miss out on it. So what do we need? Continuity of policy and approach. You might say fat chance of that, but no. That's what we need to aim for. That's what we need to aspire to. And then we need to aspire to reaching agreements around what it is that we want to be good at. Now, it doesn't mean to the exclusion of everything else, and there's a very clear role for pure research in all of this, very clear role, because that's where you get the serendipity. But we need to get some focus into what we're doing, and that then flows through a whole range of different aspects of our economy, from research, education to skills, training, outputs, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I'll leave it. Not to the point of sort of mass planning, central planning from above, but just some policy agreements around what we need, where we need to go.
Yes, I don't think anyone's looking forward to the Innes Willock's great 5-year leap forward and plan.
Oh, I am, but that's all right. Yeah.
We'll see whether we come to that. And I'll come back to you shortly too, Roy. But Matt Linden, let's come to you from the point of industry super. Patient capital is what you guys are. That's what you do. You invest for the long term for the benefit of the members. So where do you see the opportunities and where do you see the challenges from the point of view of industry super?
Good morning, John. Good morning, everyone. Look, I'm tremendously optimistic. We should be much better placed than is currently the case when it comes to early stage venture capital funding. We have a tremendous asset as a nation in our superannuation system. We have $3 trillion in superannuation savings, which, as you point out, has a long-term investment horizon. We're only one of 4 countries internationally that have got a long-term funding pool of that scale relative to the size of their economy. So we should actually be world leaders in this space. But there's tremendous opportunities there, and the system is now, and funds in particular, have developed a scale now where there's a real appetite for this type of investment. And it's really important for members because having a diverse range of investments is vital to generating those long-term returns. So rather than investing through traditional sources, listed equities, fixed interest, etc., there's a need for the funds to diversify. And when I speak to our senior chief investment officers, this is the space which they're looking at. Now, as it stands at the moment, industry funds are the largest investors in private equity among those institutional funds. And indeed, when we look at the ABS statistics around private equity funding, superannuation funds are contributing the largest share. But most of it is not necessarily at the early stage venture capital. It's more mature, later stage private equity where the funding is flowing, and there's a real challenge in those early stages. So first thing around the scale, so far as the institutional investors, the scale is certainly there in terms of the money and the mandates and trying to find the next best thing to invest in. One thing which I would say, John, is that there's a need for policy stability. So for our superannuation system, this is important. Probably been hearing a lot around superannuation policy recently, and it is vital in order to invest for the long term that there's some policy stability within our superannuation settings. So, we know that there's a legislated increase in the super guarantee, but the preservation rules, for instance, are really important. So when you hear these debates around early access for super and housing and other things, they can certainly detract from the sorts of investments which the funds could be contemplating in terms of long-term funding in venture capital funding, for instance. The third thing which I just wanted to briefly cover off on, and we'll no doubt come to this in more detail, are the commercialization vehicles. What does the opportunity look like with large institutional investors? And to be fair, there are a number of different models here. The funds can invest alongside with government. So the Medical Research Commercialization Fund is a really good example. They can invest alongside with venture capital managers. There's plenty of great case studies in that space, and they can also do it directly. But a key thing really, and I think from the university's point of view, is that the funds can only invest in companies. So private equity funding. They're not in a position where they can provide research grants. There's got to be an investable opportunity there. So there is a real challenge for getting the right sorts of vehicles, research and the commercial vehicles and companies which sit around them, which would enable some of this funding to flow, and finding ways in which that funding can be structured to support those research efforts.
Okay, I'll come back to Roy and Ennis in a moment, but you're just giving me an idea, and I should, first of all, I should declare I have done some consultancies for Industry Super Australia, and I'll put that on the table in case anyone says, hang on, you didn't disclose. I've done some work with them in the past, and it's been fascinating, but it's given me an insight. What would the chances be, instead of industry funds competing with each other for the few opportunities that are out there in the market, what would be the chance if, for instance, some of the big funds, Host Plus, CBUS or Aussie Super or whatever, if you set up a venture capital fund just of your own and you said, okay, none of us want to put too much in here. We don't want to, risk too much of our members' precious capital, but we do have $3 trillion to play with. So how about if everyone kicks in, I don't know, 50 million or whatever, we've got a pool of 150 million, and that way we're spreading our risk, and we can not give grants to universities, we can invest with universities in some of the opportunities that are around. Does anyone talk like that within your circles?
Well, look, I mean, the funds do have collective pooled investment managers. IFM Investors is one, and they've got a private equity capability as well. So there are some vehicles which certainly do have characteristics which could support that. We need to understand too, though, that a number of the funds now are at very significant scale where instead of, for instance, perhaps using third-party private equity investment managers and venture capital investment managers, they will be looking to develop some of this expertise internally as well. But there's no single model, I think, John, which is necessarily the right one. Many of these opportunities require a significant amount of due diligence and expertise, and there'll be specific investment managers who are very well placed to provide that. What we do see is in a number of these instances and case studies where the funds actually have cooperated and collectively they've contributed the funds which are necessary for commercialisation. And there are a number of different models there which I alluded to with government and others with private managers too.
All right, thanks, Matt. I'll come to winners in a moment, but Roy, let me put it back on the universities. Have you personally built relationships across some of the silos we were talking about before? Have you mentored people and given examples and given leadership on how this is how you do it? And I'll come to winners on the same thing from the industry side of things as well, because there's a lot of kind of, oh, I'm waiting for someone else to do this. There's a lot of that mentality we hear when people talk about reform.
Yes, I think I could say that I have over the experience of an academic career, but in addition to that, I've had experience on both sides of the fence, if we like to put it like that. And on the academic side, I found the most successful opportunities have been through existing institutions such as the CRCs, or in response to grant programs like the ARC linkage or the industrial transformation research hubs and training centres. As I said earlier, the problem is fragmentation, finding your way through all of those grant programs and ensuring that they have continuity. But it is important, I think, for academic leaders to mentor and to drive the process of engagement in their universities. It's a hard challenge because all the incentives, or many of them, point in the other direction, and they have done very significantly in the past around research publications in top-tier journals. We know all the issues around that and the way in which the research rankings then attract the international students who cross-subsidise the research to produce more top-tier journals, and that's been the virtuous or vicious cycle that we've been on, whichever way you like to look at it. And as a result, we've lost quite a lot of our potential research resources with the collapse of the international student revenues over the next few years and the loss of that pipeline.
But within the university circles itself, is enough recognition given to this kind of work? Do you get enough brownie points within the university circle, within the academy, for doing what we're talking about? Or is it kind of, looked at a bit askance?
Oh, well, I think things are changing, and certainly the ATN universities at the start, in the lead of that change process. Certainly in the past, engagement was a peculiar kind of hobby that some universities or academics engaged in, and it wouldn't have got terribly much attention. But now I think universities are increasingly paying attention to this, and also on the business side as well. I'm also chair of the Port of Newcastle, so we're developing a really interesting relationship with the University of Newcastle around hydrogen. So here's a mission or a challenge that will go to the way in which we address climate change and our whole energy transition as a country. And there's a university with huge expertise in the area, surrounded by private sector players, not just the Port of Newcastle, but Orica and other infrastructure and energy companies that are interested in making that transition. And so there's a natural engagement that could occur over the long term. And that's the sort of thing where I think business and universities can put aside all of those problems around incentives and just get down to doing the job of changing the industrial structure of our economy for the long-term public good.
Okay. There's a healthy dose of inverse snobbery in Australia, a sort of anti-intellectual streak that we've always had right back to convict days and onwards. How do you overcome it at a personal level? How do you get people from industry and business to feel comfortable talking to people who they by and large are a little wary of in universities?
It's a really good question, John, and it's sort of one of the perennials that we've all had to grapple with. It's almost like ships in the night, conversations, talking past each other rather than to each other, a lack of awareness of what motivates and drives both sides of the equation in many cases. There are, as Roy mentioned, numerous examples of great collaboration, but I think it comes back to this issue which we are all trying to break down, is to get industry to be prepared to talk to universities. It's not going, and universities talk to industry as well, but often it's a lot of this conversation is going to be driven from the industry side because they know what they want, they know what they need, they know the expertise that they're looking for, and they know the outcome that they're looking for as well. But I think, and I speak from an industry perspective, there's a lot more that industry can and should do within Australia to develop those relationships. Now, I talked earlier about scale, John. A lot of these are within the Australian context are smaller businesses. So where do they find the time, the energy and the funding to do what they need to do to grow once they've made the decision to grow or invest in a certain direction? That's a big issue. And then they need to know, who do they go and talk to? And in many cases, it's just having the right front door for industry to walk through. That's the really important thing. I mean, you talk about intellectualism. We also make it very difficult for each other. We make things overly complex sometimes. And industry just quite often needs to know, well, who do I talk to? When do I talk to them? How do we make arrangements around things that Roy was talking around IP and all those sort of issues? Can we get those resolved quickly and just get on with it? And that's what industry is after. But the one point I'd also make is when universities have an example of great collaboration, need to find ways to advertise it and to amplify it, because the first thing that business does is listen to other business. Sure. And if a business has had a good experience, they will then pick that up.
I wonder if all that Roy was saying a moment ago, and I'll come to you in a moment on this too, Matt, but I wonder if the fact that Roy is so exceptional and such an example, but such a rare example, is actually all the proof and all the evidence we need of how much more needs to be done. I mean, maybe we should be saying, hang on, industry has to reach out more and universities have to be more open. Let's actually nail down what is it that anyone who's watching this, and there's lots and lots of people in positions of influence, what can they do to sort some of these problems, to overcome some of these hurdles?
Well, John, I think, I don't want to be in the statue building business, but there should be one for Roy, because Roy is the exception to the rule here. He is the one who does get out on the front foot. And the key thing here, I think you referred to it in a question earlier, is there's a lot of waiting around for other people to do things. So do we wait for government incentives, or do we wait for somebody to approach us? I think it's purely and simply as getting out on the front foot. Matt's been talking about the role of super. I'm Deputy Chair of Australian Super. We spend an enormous amount of effort and time thinking about what more we can do for the Australian economy. But it has to be within the understanding and the constraints that we have to make a member's return. Super is like the golden honeypot for so many different aspects of the community. We're not just about to dole money out willy-nilly. We have to have some prospect of making a return, and that's fundamentally what it is. So it will play its role. Other parts of the economy will play their role, but you're almost right on the money. It's quite simply a matter of people getting out there and talking again. And COVID has to create the opportunity to do that, given the impact on industry, where government is going with its incentive programs, and the impact on the university sector through the loss of overseas students. That's why commercialisation and joint research has got to be one of, not the only, but one of the key platforms and models to take the sector forward.
All right, Matt, on exactly that point.
Yeah, so I had a very interesting discussion, John, with Sam Cecilia, who's the Chief Investment Officer of Host Plus, late last week in advance of this session. And Host Plus is one of the key funds, along with Australian Super, who've got particular expertise in this area. And he's a very, very powerful advocate, I think, for early stage venture capital funding. They're a particular fund that's got a very young age demographic. So it's in their interest to look at these long-term investment opportunities and invest to that end. Sam's very unique. He's got a PhD in physics, so he's across and can get across the detail of many of these innovations very quickly in the way that maybe some can't. But one point which he made to me is these interactions and establishing these contacts are absolutely vital in terms of progressing things and creating, you know, the vehicles which create the investment opportunities. And one thing which he mentioned to me is that having some expertise from business embedded within the university. So looking to potentially employing people who've retired from particular industry sectors where you know you've got research expertise and embedding them within the university to be able to identify those commercialisation opportunities and also to have the links potentially to business as well may be a good way forward in terms of getting these different participants who need to collaborate working together better.
All right, well, let's go to the statuesque Professor Roy Green, who I don't know how you feel about being cast in bronze. First of all, Roy, how does that sound?
Sounds like a challenge that I need now to live up to, I think. Just following on from the points that Ines and Matthew made, let's not make all this too complicated. Although the words have been somewhat overworked in recent years, the notion of precincts and ecosystems always crops up when you look at successful models around the world. And this is something that we haven't really done very well. We've got some fairly informal networks around Australia in various areas of specialisation or of geographical concentration. But over the next few years, I think governments are now looking at this more closely, and we do have an immense opportunity there to build those structures that enable long-term and ongoing collaboration, not in that sense that is sometimes conceived of as a linear process of lab to market. So, you know, you're doing all that research, why isn't it a product? It's more in the way of problem solving, of sometimes serendipitous encounters around various projects or ideas that academics may have in conjunction with people in industry. Obviously precincts around the world are pretty well known, the most obvious one being Silicon Valley, but there are plenty of others around manufacturing, around medtech, around MIT, around Cambridge in the UK, around Munich, in Taiwan and South Korea. There are plenty of good examples to draw on, and we need to do something that is adapted to our own environment. And there are some areas where we're starting this up, the Tech Central project in Sydney, possibly Aerotropolis, once that gets going around advanced manufacturing, Fisherman's Bend, Clayton in Melbourne, the Tonsley Park initiative around in Adelaide, and around the Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing hub in Brisbane. You see some incipient clusters and ecosystems there, and really they have to be underpinned by public money. There's no other way around this, especially with the loss of international student revenues for universities. Someone's got to step in, and it will partly be, hopefully, some super funds. It might be the new Australian Business Growth Fund. We're yet to see how that will operate, set up by the government a few months ago, 500 million to get that one started. And then we have a number of other private sector funds, particularly those interested in climate change and renewable technologies like Pollination, with access to massive funds, and very established ones like MIRA, the Macquarie Infrastructure and Real Assets organisation. And these are obviously going to invest in areas where there's a return. And I think people are beginning to see, yes, there will be very long-term and very major returns from the switch to low emissions or zero emissions economy.
Okay, just very quickly, because I do want to get back to each of the panelists and we've only got less than 10 minutes still to go. Maybe universities aren't doing a good enough job at explaining what they do. Maybe universities aren't doing a good enough job of lobbying government. Maybe universities aren't doing a good enough job of telling everybody that they have all sorts of fabulous things available to them, but they're not selling themselves well enough, explaining themselves well enough.
Yes, I guess others can comment on that.
No, I want you to.
But I would certainly argue that we have not done enough as universities to get our case across. Often not for lack of trying on the part of universities, because good news stories don't make headlines. Industrial journalists have been the first line of redundancies, as you might know, John, in much of our media.
Let me also, though, quite specifically, and you know, if nothing else, I have a reputation for asking what Tony Abbott once called the mongrel question. Maybe universities are too bureaucratic themselves. Maybe they've become too hierarchical and too risk averse internally, and that's part of the problem. Are we capable of reflecting on that?
Well, I think that's probably true. We've developed a professional class now of university managers. What preceded them, of course, was not ideal either. The sort of self-governing academic community, which was very male-oriented and hierarchical in a different way that we wouldn't want to go back to. But certainly there's scope for greater agility on the part of universities. The ability of universities to seize on opportunities is rather limited because of that risk-averse approach. And I think that's a characteristic right across Australian industry and the university sector. Other countries are not as risk-averse as we are. We're quite happy to bet on a horse race every year, but we're not prepared to bet on something a bit longer term with a more guaranteed return or outcome to it. Things that universities can do internally, not just by setting up an engagement manager, but by making engagement part of the culture of the university. And it's that element of cultural change, I think, that we are yet to deal with effectively in Australia.
Excellent points, and thank you very much. It's very hard to reflect on the work your own colleagues have been doing, but you've done so very frankly. Matt Linden, from the point of view of industry super, if you're looking for stable returns, you're awash with cash, you're looking for opportunities for returns on patient capital. Have you heard anything today that you think might encourage industry super funds to take a further step down this path?
Well, look, I think so. There's, you know, as Ines and Roy have pointed out, our economic future must certainly be tied to value adding and being able to make the most of these the intellectual resources which we have, and to be able to take these opportunities and commercialise them successfully.
All right, now
so there's an imperative there to do it.
There certainly is. Ines, we've talked a lot about the federal government because it's the federal government that has responsibility for funding universities, but actually it's state governments that regulate them through some constitutional quirk that let's not dwell upon, but just take it from me, that's how it's always going to be. It's not about to change. Let's look at whether state governments may have some role to play here as well. Roy just touched before on the fact that there are state initiatives and the development of precincts by state governments, a classic example. Should we also be looking at state governments, not just the central government?
John, one of the big takeouts of the last year or so has been that we've all come to the realisation that the states are more powerful than perhaps we thought that they were. I mean, they have powers in all sorts of ways through all sorts of mechanisms that we'd all forgotten about or overlooked as history has gone on. We can't ignore the states. They are the deliverers of education, and they have a huge role here in the development of things like precincts, things like initiatives of directing, helping, not overseeing, but helping direct, nudge our institutions in ways that they need to go. So there's good, but this all comes back to the collaboration and the same, everyone being on the same message or same song sheet. There's no point in different states going down different directions, counterintuitively against and competing for the same resources against each other. I think this is what we're coming out of COVID, and I'm actually perversely more confident than ever coming out of COVID that we are going to get change, because going back to where you were, as a nation, we probably got a bit fat and lazy, quite honestly. I've said this before and got in a lot of trouble for saying that, so I'll be very careful about how I phrase this. But because we've relied so much on commodity exports, and we've got by on that. At the same time, universities have got by quite happily on foreign students for the past decade or so. This is going to shake everything up. And we have a whole range of now different balls in the air that we have to deal with, but there are great opportunities here. The key point is to get people to talking to each other and not going off in different directions, or at least when they do go off in a different direction, everyone else knows about it, because there's got to be collaboration between governments, federal and state, and between the different states among themselves. There's got to be collaboration between business and universities as well in ways that we haven't seen before. And you're right, you're absolutely right. It's easy to say it, it's hard to do. I think everyone acknowledges this, but we have to be much more open in the conversations. And we have to make it easier for each other to do business with the other. But things like precincts and hubs and all those sort of terms that Roy has talked about, we've been bad at them in Australia, but there is now signs of life in that space where there can truly be collaboration. You look down at Geelong, for instance, with the work on carbon fibre and the like. That's a classic example. And there's more and more of those popping up, and that's what gives me the confidence that we're probably fumbling our way to get onto the right track.
All right, I'll see if there's time. I'll come back to you on the formal versus the informal ways of interacting and collaborating. But Roy, just to come back to you on state governments, you obviously have your fingers in so many pies as well. What likelihood is there that some of the leadership we're struggling to find elsewhere might come from state governments in particular locations?
Yeah, state governments are showing leadership. We've just seen the announcement of the Breakthrough Victoria Fund, $2 billion fund in Victoria. We've seen the setting up of Invest New South Wales by the New South Wales government, and accelerating R&D program as well. And in Queensland, the Advanced Queensland program, also their manufacturing hubs. There's a lot going on at state level, and the danger is that, I mean, it's good, but the danger is that it adds to the incoherence as well, because business doesn't really know where to go if you've got choices among similar sounding programs at state and federal level. And so I think a big challenge ahead of us now is to get greater coherence between federal and state programs, and if possible, seamless arrangements whereby state and federal funding commit jointly to any new programs that might be announced if under the modern manufacturing strategy, for example, catapult-like centres were to be favoured, and we'll know in the next few months whether that might be the case, then those should be that should be a network which is jointly committed to by federal and state, as was the case, some of us might remember many years ago with the National Industry Extension Service, the NIAS program, joint federal and state, highly successful.
All right, well, thank you. And just very quickly back to you also, Matt, on that. We want some competition between the states, but you don't want duplication. So back to industry super, what's the likelihood of industry super doing anything on a state-by-state basis as opposed to doing something national?
Well, there's actually a good precedent here, John. You know, you and others may be aware that our funds are very significant investors in infrastructure. You know, when you know, hopefully when we get back to flying at airports, the seaports, you know, the roads, there's really sort of no part of the public infrastructure space where our funds don't have some exposure, and we have had tremendous collaboration with states in the rollout around that and developing the models where that private sector capital can be deployed, and it frees up public sector capital for other priorities. So some states have been better than others in that respect, but certainly from our perspective, we've been able to collaborate very closely with some state governments very successfully to roll out programs and investment and create investment opportunities for our members. So,
all right, just in one minute, do you think you do have formal or informal opportunities to meet people outside of the kind of tram lines, given I'm in Melbourne, the tram lines of your daily work?
Yeah, look, I mean, that would be more at the coalface for the individual chief investment officers of the funds. But, you know, I think it's an area where there's a need for improvement and to create some mechanisms for that collaboration, you know, so that there's these informal and formal lines of communication. I think that's an area where we can certainly improve things. And
all right, and in reverse order, Inez, likewise, the informal and formal, I mean, people can set up, like we have with this conference, set up opportunities for people to exchange within a formal environment, but sometimes it's the informal, the chance encounter, the social encounter, meeting someone at the football or whatever, that makes all the difference. How do you best foster and entrench these relationships?
I think Roy used the word earlier, John, which was serendipitous, and I think that's where we need to have the space to allow the serendipity to happen. We have sort of the planning through the modern manufacturing strategy of 6 key areas, but there are still going to be other areas across our economy where we are going to need and want and have to have collaboration occur.
But we're increasingly tribal, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yeah, we are, and that's the problem. But we have to create the circumstances to have it. So this is about having the open door. I think that's the important thing. And being open to opportunity. I think that's where both sides have been a little bit constrained and perhaps constipated before. It's about having the willingness to be open to have those exchanges.
All right, Roy Green, I'll give you the final word, but please nothing about laxatives off the back of Inez telling us we're constant.
I'm giving him so many leads. I've given Roy so many leads to that.
Well, we've been talking about this area for a very long time, and I think post-COVID provides a bit of urgency, plus the end of the commodity boom, especially if we see iron ore exports flatten out over the next few years. We're certainly seeing it in relation to other commodities. And we face the danger now of having a hollowed out third world industrial structure to maintain a first world lifestyle, which we can do at the moment through the royalties on our massive royalties on our iron ore exports. But how do we diversify as an economy beyond that? It's not going to happen by selling each other residential housing or tourism hotspots. It's going to happen because we renovate our industrial structure, and that means new technologies, new business models, partly around manufacturing, but also around a lot of the other areas that have been identified by governments and business and universities over the years, in the context of a framework that sets out missions for the economy, as other countries are doing.
Look, thank you very much, Roy, Inez, Matt. That's been 4 pale male whales talking to each other about this topic, but it's been absolutely fantastic way to kickstart the discussions that we're going to have through the course of the rest of today, tomorrow and Wednesday. Thank you all very, very much. If any of the people watching want to know more about any of our 3 speakers, their full bios are available on the ATN website. Now, we'll be back at 1:30 for a discussion on economic trends, which is going to be picking the brains of some experts to explain to us exactly where their views take the economy into the future. And you can join the conversation on social media, on Twitter, at ATN, all caps, at ATN Unis is where you'll find the discussion on Twitter, which is a great way of occasionally dishing out abuse to people, but in a friendly and appropriate manner. But no, more importantly, it's a way of exchanging ideas and information and leading people off onto conversations with each other in a collaborative framework, as we've just been discussing. So let's have a short break. The University of South Australia have a video presentation for us, and then we'll be back to discuss economic trends at 1:30 Eastern Time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anne Herrmann. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Newcastle. And with my research, I help understand how we can better support cancer patients with making very difficult decisions regarding their treatment. Many cancer patients have a variety of treatment options available to them, and many of these options have the same impact on their length of life, but they come with very different side effects, which are valued differently by different patients. So finding the right treatment for each individual patient can be very challenging. And in my PhD, I'm doing in-depth interviews, but also large-scale surveys with hundreds of cancer patients to find out how they made their decision and how they would like to make such difficult decisions. And that's an important step towards providing optimal cancer care that is not just focused on the disease, but on the patient as a person. I'm from Eastern Germany. I did my studies in Leipzig, which is a beautiful city in the eastern part of Germany. I've lived in Newcastle for a bit more than 2 years now. And I really do enjoy it. It's a great place to be in. There are lots and lots of beaches and they are all stunning. Heaps of sunshine, and I think especially if you don't like cold weather, that's the place to be, because what they call winter here is like a German spring maybe. So yeah, I do enjoy myself here. And also, before I came here, I thought there wouldn't be many cultural differences. But when I started to live and work here, I realized that many things work slightly differently. Aussie English is like a language in itself. And I've actually considered buying a dictionary just for Aussie English. So when I came here, I struggled a bit with people who have a very thick accent. But also when I started working in this area, I had to learn quite a few new terms related to cancer or decision-making, behavioral science, all these things. And I had a couple of great opportunities. For example, I could compete in the 3-minute thesis competition and promote my research, and had the opportunity to address people who don't work in my area and to tell them what I'm actually doing here. I also gave a speech to people who might consider doing a PhD here at the University of Newcastle. So I have the feeling that I'm very well supported, first in my research, but also in promoting my research and telling people what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
The Newcastle Institute for Energy Resources, commonly known as NEAR, is a federal government initiative. It's about best practice industry, academia collaboration. It's about working with industry to give them competitive advantage in a sector of national significance. The best outcome for energy resources sector in Australia by working with a model like NEAR is to develop the skills and the knowledge to meet the challenges of the future. Certainly there's environmental, social impact, technical challenges in a more competitive global environment. I think there's enormous opportunity if we can leverage off a multidisciplinary approach to solving problems to be able to maintain our competitiveness and to continue to grow and be prosperous. The idea that knowledge is just created by people in white coats in labs is false. We also can now generating a significant amount of knowledge with our engagement with industry and real life problems. What we're doing is still focusing on the needs of the industry, and as the needs of the industry transform, as the market demand changes, we are keeping track of that. More importantly, we're trying to preempt the market needs and stay ahead of what the competition and what the competitive advantage they need to deliver as the sectors evolve. I mean, certainly we have challenges as expectations of society and the global economy shift, but we have many advantages to deliver as a country. But to leverage that, we need to be available to develop the skills and the knowledge to be able to sustain that transition. The importance of the energy and resources sector locally and to the national economy is massive. Not only in its wealth creation and the jobs opportunities that it creates, but it also delivers infrastructure and skills to regions. And off that, we can leverage significant opportunities, both in agriculture and other sectors like water. To me, it's the regions of Australia are our competitive advantage, and the more that we invest in their development will give us a relevance and an ongoing growth as a country.
my name is Anne Herrmann. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Newcastle. And with my research, I help understand how we can better support cancer patients with making very difficult decisions regarding their treatment. Many cancer patients have a variety of treatment options available to them, and many of these options have the same impact on their length of life, but they come with very different side effects, which are valued differently by different patients. So finding the right treatment for each individual patient can be very challenging. And in my PhD, I'm doing in-depth interviews, but also large-scale surveys with hundreds of cancer patients to find out how they made their decision and how they would like to make such difficult decisions. And that's an important step towards providing optimal cancer care that is not just focused on the disease, but on the patient as a person. I'm from Eastern Germany. I did my studies in Leipzig, which is a beautiful city in the eastern part of Germany. I've lived in Newcastle for a bit more than 2 years now. And I really do enjoy it. It's a great place to be in. There are lots and lots of beaches and they are all stunning. Heaps of sunshine, and I think especially if you don't like cold weather, that's the place to be, because what they call winter here is like a German spring maybe. So yeah, I do enjoy myself here. And also, before I came here, I thought there wouldn't be many cultural differences. But when I started to live and work here, I realized that many things work slightly differently. Aussie English is like a language in itself. And I've actually considered buying a dictionary just for Aussie English. So when I came here, I struggled a bit with people who have a very thick accent. But also when I started working in this area, I had to learn quite a few new terms related to cancer or decision-making, behavioral science, all these things. And I had a couple of great opportunities. For example, I could compete in the 3-minute thesis competition and promote my research, and had the opportunity to address people who don't work in my area and to tell them what I'm actually doing here. I also gave a speech to people who might consider doing a PhD here at the University of Newcastle. So I have the feeling that I'm very well supported, first in my research, but also in promoting my research and telling people what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
The Newcastle Institute for Energy Resources, commonly known as NEAR, is a federal government initiative. It's about best practice industry academia collaboration. It's about working with industry to give them competitive advantage in a sector of national significance. The best outcome for energy resources sector in Australia by working with a model like NEAR is to develop the skills and the knowledge to meet the challenges of the future. Certainly there's environmental, social impact, technical challenges in a more competitive global environment. I think there's enormous opportunity if we can leverage off a multidisciplinary approach to solving problems to be able to maintain our competitiveness and continue to grow and be prosperous. The idea that knowledge is just created by people in white coats in labs is false. We also can now generate a significant amount of knowledge with our engagement with industry and real life problems. What we're doing is still focusing on the needs of the industry, and as the needs of the industry transform, as the market demand changes, we are keeping track of that. More importantly, we're trying to preempt the market needs and stay ahead of what the competition and what the competitive advantage they need to deliver as the sectors evolve. I mean, certainly we have challenges as expectations of society and the global economy shift, but we have many advantages to deliver as a country. But to leverage that, we need to be available to develop the skills and the knowledge to be able to sustain that transition. The importance of the energy and resources sector locally and to the national economy is massive. Not only in its wealth creation and the jobs opportunities that it creates, but it also delivers infrastructure and skills to regions. And off that we can leverage significant opportunities both in agriculture and other sectors like water. To me, it's the regions of Australia are our competitive advantage, and the more that we invest in their development will give us a relevance and an ongoing growth as a country.
Good afternoon and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us for our next session looking at economic trends as part of our discussion at the ATN Solutions Summit. There is a hashtag for Twitter. It's not just at ATN Unis, all caps for ATN and a capital U for Unis. It's also hashtag ATN Solutions Summit if you'd like to join in on Twitter in that, what was it called? The swamp for sewer rats, I think Chris Ullman called it the other day. But thank you very much for coming back for this next session, which is going to look at economic trends and labour market forces as we try and see the future. And we'll be joined shortly from Western Australia by Associate Professor Rebecca Castles. But first up, Associate Professor Sally Weller, Lenora Rees from RMIT, Sally's from Uni South Australia, Anthea Bill from the University of Newcastle, and Aidoan Ulka from Deakin University here in Victoria. And our discussion will focus on not just trying to pretend that we can see the future, because we can't, but to try and work out how best we can measure things within the context of looking at the sort of solutions that we need for the things we've been discussing all morning. And then after this session, there's a short break, and then the Treasurer of South Australia will be joining us, Rob Lucas, for his analysis, which will be absolutely fascinating because South Australia is right at the leading edge on a lot of this stuff as well. So very much looking forward to all of the things we're going to learn during the course of the rest of this afternoon, as well as tomorrow and Wednesday. So let's start off with our panel. And if I could start with you, Sally, if you could be our first participant on the panel, and we'll see when Rebecca's able to join us as well. Take us through some of the economic trends that you think we ought anticipate, we can reasonably foresee, given that this is such an unforeseeable world these days. I think we've got you still muted. If you cut again without the mute button, that would be even better, Sally, and thank you very much. Go ahead.
Sorry. A massive question, and of course we don't really know what's going to happen. Clearly, people are thinking about ways where we can localise supply chains. One of the big effects of COVID has been disruption of global supply chains. One of the big effects of COVID has been disruption of the easy reliance on China for consumer goods, so a major shift in world geopolitics. Another effect has been the awareness that the sort of labour market conditions we've had in some industries like aged care and health and supporting health cannot continue for health reasons. That, of course, is going to massively increase the costs of some of those services. Everybody's thinking about ways in which we can rejig the economies of places like Melbourne without so many international students and international visitors in the city. I think everyone would agree Melbourne's economy has been driven by visitors for a long, long time. It will be a big change to go back to less reliance. The universities have to learn to live without revenue from so many international students. I read the other day that America and England have been trying to ramp up to bring international students in to replace the Australian market. And that's not surprising that they would do that. But it does mean that there'll be some long-term adjustments that we won't, I think, bounce straight back after COVID.
Okay, and still staying with you for a moment, South Australia's been through tumultuous times. Take us through the peaks and the troughs and how you think we best learn from both the things that have been done that were right and the things that have been done that were wrong in dealing with those challenges and the peaks and troughs that followed.
Do you want me to talk about the history since liberalisation? Since liberalisation, we have had in the Hawke reforms of the late 1980s, in most regional parts of Australia, we've had a relentless decline of manufacturing and related employment opportunities. We've had relentless decline in all regional areas outside of places like Newcastle and Geelong that have industrial economies as second cities. These things we have responded to, but we actually have no solution, and possibly COVID will open up opportunities for thinking about different solutions than we've had before. I listened to the earlier session, and what the economics experts in that session were saying is that we need to harness these different sources of capital to find viable investments to move the economy forward. If we think about places like, say, the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, there have been so many efforts to find sources of economic growth in those areas, but once it gets down to the tin tax, those cost-benefit analyses don't end up recommending investment in those places, which means those solutions that rely entirely on the workings of capital investment processes are not going to solve the problem in most parts of regional Australia. At the moment, South Australia is doing a great deal to work out new ways to work collaboratively with industry, and particularly with state-supported industry such as the growth in defence, to find new models that will bring growth and development and skill development into South Australia without relying on the bare bones of those market processes.
You're still very vulnerable, though, just still sticking with South Australia, in the same way as you were heavily dependent on the car industry while it was there. It now seems that you're hitching your wagon so closely to the defence industry. Aren't you at risk of repeating the same eggs in one basket dependence?
There is not a lot of options, and if you take the example of the car industry or the Whyalla Steelworks, all these industries in the past have been reliant on decisions made in other countries and capital made in other countries. The defence industry will not be the same because it's got a more strategic focus and it's got direct federal government support, which will have enough interest in it to maintain it in the longer term, which those other industries didn't have.
All right, Anthea, if we can get you to take us through what you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses and some of the challenges and opportunities, just for the overview, and then we'll drill down with Lenora and Ardawan as well.
Yeah, so just from sort of global kind of macro perspective, just thinking about where we landed at the end of where we are now when we think about the March GDP results. So we saw that GDP result for the year of minus 1.1%, and that very strong growth, 3.1% for December. Certainly when we have a look at what the headline labour market figures are doing, we can see the unemployment rate, the level of employment is falling faster than many people have expected. That's what the headline rate's telling us anyway. We're seasonally adjusted unemployment rate now at 5.6%, so 0.75 percentage point below where we started when COVID hit. I mean, that would be better than a lot of people would have expected when we were looking at the outcome of COVID initially in the Australian labour market. The participation rate, 66.3%. The headline figure, again, not bad. The employment to population ratio kind of almost recovering, hours coming back. The unemployment rate, which spiked at the beginning of this pandemic, and that was really concerning, looking to recover quite significantly at the beginning of this year. But I think one of the interesting things, though, is that we're sitting with a vacancy rate of 2.2% at the moment, and that's quite a significant high. So that growth in the vacancy rate is the highest that we've seen since the global financial crisis, and yet we're sitting with a level, of the unemployment rate which is not quite as low as we might expect it to be for that vacancy rate. So I think the pandemic has churned up the Australian labour market quite a bit, as it has labour markets internationally. And I think there are really important reasons to be looking below those headline figures to see what's happening in terms of the matching in the labour market. And certainly just, very cursory look at the kind of industries that have lost jobs and the industries that have gained jobs to deliver that headline rate. We can see that there hasn't necessarily been matching of that employment growth and those job losses. Also, when we look below the bonnet, below the headline rate, to have a look at the impacts across age groups, and this has been commented on a lot in the Australian labour market, we can still see now where we're sitting in March 2021, we're still seeing some more adverse impacts for youth within the Australian labour market than we're seeing in the headline rates. 2% job loss in seasonally versus 0.6% in the labour market growth in the labour market overall. But I think the other thing is that we know, in our economy, as in all advanced economies, it really hinges on growth. And so we're sitting with a recovery that might have been more V-shaped, we might have expected. At this point in time, it's looking a little bit more V-shaped anyway, but that growth rate is still pretty low, and we know some of those drivers of growth, including household spending, business investment, were weak coming into this pandemic. I mean, the household sector has performed better than many people might have expected. House prices are a big part of that, and wealth effects are a big part of that too, and then we can reflect on the stability of those trends and whether they're likely to continue in the economy over 2021.
You very carefully didn't use the B word, the bubble word, and thank you for doing that, but I will. We'll come back to housing specifically, but I'm wondering, as I hear your overview, is it a bit like, you know, Paul Keating famously said it was the recession we had to have when he was the treasurer. Has COVID given us the, you know, the seismic shock to the economy that's been a long time coming?
Has there been necessary structural change over this period? I don't know that that's really been what's happened. And I think there was a lid put on spending, and then I think there was fiscal policy that came through, which, you know, unprecedented levels of fiscal support. And so even the IMF, which is, you know, an institution that necessarily favours, you know, high levels of fiscal support, has said that, you know, there would have been 3 times the level of impact had not economies moved towards fiscal support. So I think there's been some fiscal support coming through. I think that's flowed through into spending. We saw it flow through into the spending of lower income households midway through the year through the increase in job seeker and the ability to access superannuation. We saw it flow through into wealthier households as they switched their spending from things like international travel back to domestic spending and shift from services to goods, which is kind of interesting in the Australian economy to see that shift from services to goods. It's fairly curious. I think some of these are just pandemic induced. I'm not quite sure how much structural changes, you know, if any important structural changes has happened necessarily at this point, although it could obviously be a springboard for further change in the Australian economy if we look to get, you know, longer term changes happening. I think there's been impacts on small business, and particularly severe impacts on small business, which we need to consider as well. And you know, those sectors that have been heavily impacted and remain heavily impacted have a preponderance of small business too. But I'm not sure about the structural shifts, and certainly if you're sitting in tourism and education, there wouldn't be shifts that you'd be thinking very favourably about if they were to continue. Yeah.
It's one of my bugbears, though, that during COVID, everyone's talked about tourism and hospitality as if they are the economy, and they're not. They're actually discretionary spending in a tiny, tiny part of the economy. But endlessly, my colleagues in the media, my former colleagues in the media, have focused on the disaster stories from tourism and hospitality, but that's not really telling us what's going on. But we'll come back to housing, we'll come back to regional economies, we'll come back to lots of things. But Odewan, if I come to you and you in talking in particular about labour, yes, sure, the headline unemployment rate is better than was expected, but underemployment is still a major problem, and hidden unemployment is still a major problem. So where do you think we really are at, as opposed to where we think we're at?
I think there has been some improvement in underemployment. So underemployment has been falling recently. But yeah, I mean, I think we've still got to keep an eye on hours worked in the Australian economy, certainly wages. I mean, that's the other thing we haven't spoken about, is that we have very weak wage growth in the Australian economy coming into this, very weak inflation coming out of that. That impact on consumer spending was starting to weigh, which had been long-standing post-GFC, was starting to weigh on the business sector coming into this pandemic. So I think, you know, to the extent that the recovery has been driven by consumer spending, and I think that's something that we need to think about, you know, how robust is that consumer spending off the back of low wage growth long term, and where does this pandemic leave us in terms of that wage growth for Australian workers?
Thank you, Anthony. I'll come back to you shortly. Odewan, on the same thing, because labour market movements are your area of special expertise, and we'll come to the impact of COVID in a moment. But just generally, Odewan, tell us what you see is going on with underemployment as well as unemployment.
Being an health and labour economist, I want to first highlight some implications of the pandemic in terms of the implications for mental health and working from home being a norm rather than an exception. But then I can also comment on I specifically looked at with the project the youth whether the pandemic had different implications in terms of youth versus the adult unemployment in the context of regional Geelong labor market, but I didn't really find much difference there, and I didn't find huge impacts in terms of the youth unemployment. That's one thing that I know for sure looking at the ABS data. But also in terms of the impact of the pandemic on like the working from home being a norm now, I would like to talk that the working from home now had also both the benefits and the adverse consequences, right? In terms of the benefits, it has definitely reduced the commuting time, improved for some of us the work satisfaction, and also the maybe gave some of us a greater sense of control of our work. Also, it may also have reduced some of the dealings that we had to go through with our colleagues, and the workplace relationships also have dramatically changed, right? So, but at the same time, the working from home brought the isolation together with, so that isolation had implications for our mental health. Maybe we felt disconnected from the other people. Now, some of us, it has been a difficult thing to keep the balance between work and also the family life, the responsibilities of the within household responsibilities such as the childcare and so on. So that also brought lots of difficulties in terms of keeping that balance between work and that household problems. For some of us, the uncertainties that brought together in terms of whether we are performing okay in terms of our productivity and so on. So that has been another issues that we had to deal with. Also some sleep problems, insomnia for some of us through the mental health issues has been really difficult for some of us. And also, so the COVID had this implication for our mental health through this isolation, working from home, but also it had some direct impacts also for some of us losing jobs. And so Australian university sector had gone through a huge major restructuring, lots of problems there as well. I could continue with more.
No, let's continue the conversation. Do you think these are lasting, or do you think they're transient? Because a lot of these things are going to just disappear as people return to the office. And, you know, for everyone who hated working from home, there was someone who loved it. For everyone who's looking forward to going back to work, there are people who are dreading it.
Yeah, it may not be the 100% persistent, but obviously some of it will remain. And now we will see more and more arrangements for people for preferring to work from home, right? So now also this has implications for the cost cutting for some of the workplaces, that they are thinking of keeping that balance of persistent arrangements in terms of working from home versus working in the office where possible, right? So obviously this may have implications for efficiency concerns as well. So it may increase the efficiency for some of the industries, not all obviously, but I think it will be persistent for a while, working from home.
Okay. All right, now, Leonora, let's not pretend for a moment that the impact of COVID has been felt equally across the economy. It's obviously not, and we've talked a lot and we've heard much discussion and debate about whether or not we've had a pink recession and we're having a blue recovery. In other words, women were hardest hit, but men are getting the benefit of the investment to get people back to work. How have you seen it?
That's right, John. Thank you for having me as part of the conversation. I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining you from the lands of the Yugambeh people in southeast Queensland. This question about the gender impacts was evident right from the start. And I think talking big picture about economic growth, what we want to be talking about is inclusive growth and inclusive recovery. We are familiar with the notion of this V shape, which is positive in the sense of the economy overall making a bounce back and a recovery. What I'd like to suggest is we think about a K shape. So we have our letter V and we have another potential segment of the economy which are not recovering and they're bottoming out. So imagine a letter K where we have this segregation or division within our economy. And that's the people who are being left out of the picture in terms of the recovery, because there are very different stories going on. We have our headline figures of the unemployment rate, which Anthea has covered. And Anthea is exactly right that we need to disaggregate that according to different demographic groups, different industries. Anthea has mentioned youth, and a major one here is gender, disaggregating that by gender. If we look at the underemployment rate alone, and for those who are tuning in, underemployment, that's people who have a job, but they're not getting as many hours as they would like. Amongst women, that has consistently been higher, the underemployment rate. So even if we're saying it looks like signs of recovery, women's labour force participation dropped, it's now increased again. It looks like they're finding job opportunities. That underemployment gap between men and women is very persistent, particularly amongst young women. And so I guess going forward, when we want to monitor our progress and our recovery, it's about disaggregating the economic metrics, the economic indicators according to gender, according to age, according to geographical location, because there are so many different stories happening in this economy. You're right, there are industry patterns in terms of tourism and travel, but even if we look at the industries that have been in really high demand, such as healthcare and social assistance, those people look like they have a job, they've got job security, but we're talking about mental health issues and potential burnout for some of those workers on the front line. So I think it's a case by case, it's a matter of analysing case by case, what are the pressure points for each segment of the economy. And in terms of working from home, it's true that it's brought a lot of advantages, but there is a risk that we have seen a re-entrenchment of gender pattern roles, because we know that disproportionately it was women more so than men who were taking responsibility for homeschooling and picking up more of the domestic load. Now, just because we're going back to the office or going back on site doesn't mean that those gender patterns which have resurfaced automatically dissipate. What we're seeing is proportionally more men who are going back to the office, or more people without children, and that throws up a whole lot of potential disadvantages in terms of the advantages of being present in the office and unconscious bias that comes from being able to talk with your colleagues and network compared to those who aren't in the office. So in terms of inequality, the research prior to this pandemic pointed towards pandemics widening economic inequality. And I think there are so many signs here that that is what is going to happen unless we put a concerted effort towards preventing those gaps from widening.
Okay, understanding something and analysing it is one thing, but then actually doing something about it is another. So who, first of all, if you could take us through how you see it, I'll go back through the panel. Who do you think has responsibility to do something about this, and what do you want to see done?
That's an excellent question, because I think there is shared responsibility across many parts of the economy. Keeping in mind at a government level, we're talking about what is within the domain of the federal government and what is within the domain of state governments and local governments. From an organisational point of view, we want to think about employers, what is their responsibility? And then in recent times, I've also been tuning into the efforts that are being encouraged amongst the not-for-profit philanthropic sector. So where can they play a role? So I guess it's no single one, but I think federal government could lead by example in terms of implementing a gender lens and a gender responsive budgeting approach. And if we had that approach, you are less likely to see such strong support for male-dominated areas such as construction and trades, which are generally important for revitalising an economy, but really was not the a correct recipe for addressing the nature of this economic shock. And so as a case in point, if we look at the federal government, what they could do differently, adopting a gender lens or a gender responsive budget would be one approach to design policies that are better targeted at the segments of the economy who were hardest hit. The same sort of approach can be applied in terms of state and in terms of private sector investment too.
Okay, I'll go to Sally next, but just on that point before I let you go, the reason construction was given priority is because it creates a whole supply chain. Whereas if, for instance, you put money into some of the areas, the service economies or areas where there are high proportions of women working, there aren't the same supply chain benefits to the economy. Isn't that the argument?
So the question is, was the construction industry hardest hit by the lockdowns and by the shock, or were they going to sustain themselves relatively better anyway compared to the industries which were compelled to lock down and suffered a decrease in aggregate demand early on in the pandemic, as opposed to second round effects when we saw that overall slump in economic activity. And there's also econometric modelling that shows that investment in some of these care services actually generates economy-wide benefits, because you are freeing up people to be able to then participate more fully in the paid economy. So I would say, yes, you can do your analysis of what are the economy-wide benefits of investing in construction infrastructure. Absolutely, that's important. There are supply chains. We know that those benefits exist, but it's a matter of relativities here. Which sectors were hardest hit by the pandemic? Yeah.
All right, Sally, on that particular point and what you were saying before about regional economies, South Australia in particular, for instance, and that's a very heavy blue collar economy. What do you make of the analysis that we've just had there?
I think that that with construction, it's useful because it creates shovel-ready, quick jobs to soak up excess. I think that's fine. I think that the supply chain argument probably exaggerates the extent to which the construction industry draws on local supplies. There's an awful lot of building supplies being imported. But I think the biggest problem with it is that we've now in the habit in Australia of building things for the sake of building them rather than because we needed to. I'm talking particularly now about a lot of the residential tower construction and city office construction rather than the railway tracks. And that is a model of development which says that if you keep on building things, you create the financial rents from the people that live in them, and you get the stable returns people want from building the building. But actually it does nothing to sustain the overall economy. And once they're built, they don't create any jobs at all. They just are things that need to be filled. I think we've got a problem that we are much better at attracting populations than we are at creating jobs for the populations, and construction does not resolve that contradiction at all. So I think we should be thinking about ways that we can reduce our reliance on those types of constructions. Public infrastructure for the public good, I exclude, but for the big constructions that are there for the construction and nothing else.
All right.
Are not sensible.
All right, I'll come to Anthea on that in a moment, but just still with you, Sally, just point blank, do we have a housing bubble and is it going to burst?
It's not my area, but if you look at somewhere like Melbourne, quality housing is very scarce, so obviously it's not a bubble. People want to live in a decent house, they're going to have to pay for it because most of the recently built houses don't have the amenities that people have realised that they want now they've been at home with COVID.
All right, so you think there's actually a two-speed housing market is what you're saying. There's an oversupply of inappropriate stock and an undersupply of highly desirable stock, so you've got the two aren't meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, Anthea, what do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I think the rule of thumb is that 30% of people own their house outright, 30% are mortgagees, and 30% are renting. And so if you own your house outright in the Australian housing market and you bought your house 2 decades ago, you don't have an affordability problem. You just have wealth, you have capital gain, and that's you've sitting great, wonderful. I mean, I think it's, so I think this becomes part of the problem is that, it's the rental market, and over the course of this year, there are many now Australian coastal cities, including Newcastle, where I am, that have a 0% vacancy rate of rental properties. And so you can think what that does for the price of rentals and what that does for the price of rentals for sole parents with children, for a whole range of low-income families, for low-income people, and then the ricochet, the effect of that on their day-to-day living, their day-to-day lifestyle. So, I mean, but if you're a mortgagee who bought your house 5 years ago, or you own your house outright, the house price growth which has occurred in regional Australia, which last year was threefold the house price growth that occurred in capital cities, and that's the first time that's happened since 2004. Really interesting trends in the pandemic potentially around the migration growth that might have fed into that. We know that's not the whole story because interest rates have been low. It's been quantitative easing, which has pushed house prices up across the globe, including in pandemic impacted cities. And we've had home builder in the Australian construction industry and the housing market as well, which have all been good things for the economy in terms of those wealth effects flowing through into consumer spending. We know when we start to see some winding back and some tightening around with APRA increasing lending, some increased tightening around lending in the Australian housing market, we saw that household wealth effects started to be impacted, and we saw a wind back in household spending. So I think, when house prices started to rise at the start of the pandemic, it was, from a macroeconomic point of view, it was not necessarily a bad thing, but it's absolutely a bad thing to get into the housing market. And we think about the case
there's this
intergenerational
inequality, which is terrible.
Yeah, and we think about the pressures at the margin for those people who are in the rental market and what they can actually withstand. And for talk about job seeker and the increase in the unemployment benefit and some of those things which occurred positively over the pandemic, which have been sort of wound back a little bit recently. I think we really need to start thinking about some of the forces that this pandemic has unleashed, particularly in regional Australia, where we may not have the employment outcomes and the wage growth to support those house price rises for many segments in the housing market.
So what we've seen is a concentration of wealth, in particular with people who are established baby boomers in the capital cities at the expense of everybody else. Oh dear, no one ever sat down and thought that was a good outcome. And if you had sat down and said, this is where we're heading, people would have screamed and shouted and said, no, you can't let it happen. But let's just park that. And Idawan, I need to come back to you and bring you into the conversation again about inequality. You talked before about mental health and stress, and that's being felt very acutely, in particular amongst the people that we're just talking about a moment ago with Anthea, which is the younger people who have suddenly found the world's been completely turned on its head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's about the housing issue that Anthea mentioned the slow wage growth and all that. Given that, Anthea, do you think that housing price growth is sustainable? It's going crazy at the moment in Melbourne, and then the affordability problem is even becoming bigger and bigger for these young individuals, and also creating a disappointment in the hope that they can get their dream house at some time in the near future. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think for almost 2 decades, the OECD has been saying it's not sustainable. I think a lot of global commentators it's not sustainable. I think Reserve Bank moved to say it possibly was a problem. I think it's starting to look at it. I think a lot of commentators have said, but it still happens. And I think, I think Australia has a very, by international standards, we have a huge amount of our household wealth tied up in housing. So, for your average Australian, it's sort of the formula is already set, isn't it, to a degree? So, I mean, I don't know whether that's part of the self-propelling dynamic, but, I think a lot of economists have bet year on year that it wouldn't continue, and they've been proven wrong. Yep.
So let's turn all this back with each of you in the time that we've got left to what it means for the themes of the ATN Solutions Summit, because what we're actually trying to get everyone to focus on in this session and today, and then coming up with the Treasurer of South Australia. That's coming up in the next session. But then tomorrow and also Wednesday, we're saying, well, what are some of the structural barriers and hurdles and impediments that we're facing in order to improve collaboration between industry and universities? Well, if graduates are coming out of our universities and they've got university fee debts, HECS debts, that are now indexed and not whittling away and diminishing over time, but in fact are insurmountable, housing unaffordability, a lack of opportunities to get started on the career ladder. If we don't deal with some of these things, then the challenges of trying to commercialise and to harness some of the work being done in universities and improve the Australian economy, it's just going to be even harder. Sally, let's go back to where we started and come to you and then work our way through the panel on this question.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and say I think the solution is to keep the exchange rate at US 65 cents. If we had that, we'd have a vibrant manufacturing industry and we'd have a big export economy at the same time. The macroeconomic forces at the global scale are really an astonishing problem. I was interviewing a guy from one of the first-tier automotive suppliers, one of the companies that went broke after the majors moved out. He was telling me that they were more productive than the factories in Thailand and had a zero default rate over a 2-year period. They were the best producers in the world in their field, but they couldn't export because of the transport costs. They couldn't compete once the transport costs, because the margins are so small in those globalized production industries that extra cost of shipping from Australia just breaks the camel's back. So,
okay. Well, if that's not clickbait, I don't know what is. So people can say what they think of Sally's suggestion at hashtag ATN Solutions Summit on Twitter, if you'd like to bounce the ball around on that. We still have a car industry. We had the dollar locked in at 65 cents to the US dollar. The only problem is, of course, which comes straight to mind, that the US dollar is sinking. So do you think our dollar would be sinking along with it?
So I don't mean locking to the US dollar, literally. I mean ensuring that the Australian exchange rate makes us competitive in a global sense. And that means, for one thing, trying to reduce the amount of speculation on the Australian dollar coming from the financial sector. We all know how damaging it was when the dollar went up to 1.11 US in 2012.
Which is when the car industry was sacrificed.
So many of the things that happened, you can't directly say the car industry fell because of that rate, but it was certainly a major contributing factor. We lost a lot of other things at the time, and every time we lose things, they don't come back.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think that macroeconomic framework is crucially important. And I know that the Treasury has been buying the dollar to try and stabilise it, but I think there needs to be more. And I think if you read some of the things that people in Greece are saying about their relationship to the EU currency, there are a lot of places in the world that are trying to think of ways to defend their own economies and maintain some of the benefits of globalisation at the same time. We don't have a way to do that yet, but I think the global framework is changing post-COVID. The geopolitics is changing post-COVID, and it's time we had some conversations about some of these things.
All right. Well, I don't know if the all-powerful mining and minerals lobby would be agreeing with you, but let's throw it over first of all to you, Anthea. What do you make of Sally's clickbait idea of pegging the dollar?
Well, I think it's important to think about the manufacturing industry, particularly within our region, in the Hunter region where University of Newcastle is located. It's been a very important sector for the region historically, and we've had I don't know whether we've had as strong forces in terms of deindustrialisation. Sally, you were mentioning that we're still kind of maybe a centre with some relatively stronger industrialisation, but we certainly see the impacts of the decline of the manufacturing industry and the kind of acceleration actually that happened with the mining boom. That's one thing that we have noticed looking at the data with the appreciation of the dollar and the squeezing of the manufacturing sector. I know there were some other things happening at that time as well, but some very dramatic job losses that occurred from that period, from sort of 2013, 15, onwards. So, and if you think about the kinds of work and the skilled work and the importance of that work for people within and workers within the region, I think I would support it. I don't know how. I haven't really necessarily thought through exactly the best way to do that.
We're not limited to just Sally's suggestion of pegging the dollar. Are there other things, given that our theme...
I think pegging is taking what I said a little bit further than I went, John. Let's say
I accept your criticism.
Relationship of our economy to
Okay, I accept your criticism. Let's say protecting the dollar, but let's go back to it. Anthea, are there other suggestions you have that would be changes, structural changes we could make that would improve the prospect of innovation and collaboration in our theme here of looking?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. We have an organisation called HunterNet in the Hunter region, which is collaboration across manufacturers and looking to collaborate also with vocational education and training system, and also with higher ed. And from what my understanding, of the sector, I mean, those kinds of things can be very, very useful. And I think there's been a lot of Australian interest in those kinds of models. But could we use this pandemic period to strengthen those relationships, and to build up that the innovative capacity of the manufacturing sector? And certainly, one thing that I'm mindful of as well is that NEET group, that not in education, employment or training, and the kind of impacts that occurred for that group coming out of the GFC, and the job opportunities drying up relatively drying up for young people, and that NEET group actually increasing, and then some tracking using HILDA, which Jeff Bolin at the University of Melbourne has done, of the kind of persistent long-term disadvantage of young people that dropped out of education, employment and training. And so I think, using our manufacturing sector wisely to absorb those kinds of young people and make sure they're on a permanent, more upward trajectory would be a great structural change to come out of the pandemic. And I guess when you ask about structural change, John, I was thinking, well, I don't think we're necessarily seeing that kind of change at the moment in the Australian economy, that kind of forward planning necessarily.
No, well, there's that discontinuity that we were talking about in our first session, where there's this sort of short-termism. Leonora, I'll come to you last, but either one, let's give you a chance also to jump in here. What changes would you like to see?
Yeah, I would like to highlight the tertiary education, higher education sector, and the pandemic has shown how vulnerable we are in terms of the education sector in comparison with the US higher education or the European one. Many of the universities found the solution by firing so many people in academia and all that. So we need to maybe restructure our higher education system and try to make it less vulnerable in that sense. We have about 17,000 academics roughly lost their jobs, right? So, and education in Victoria is maybe one of the most important sectors of exporting, and also so that we need to identify the problems that we went through this pandemic, and maybe do some restructuring in that area to revitalize and see if we can have a better future for the education sector in Australia.
Thank you, everyone. And final word to you, Leonora.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think it was disappointing that we didn't see enough of a cultural shift in supporting and fostering that innovation adaptation mentality amongst businesses. The government, in contrast, is more about let's just put the economy on ice and wait for it to open up again. And it was just a missed opportunity to really accelerate those collaborations from community level, grassroots, right up to really large scale investment. So I think that requires sort of setting the tone of what type of culture do we want in terms of supporting innovation. And there is a role there for government, like the work of Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, very much talks about the public sector and identifying a purpose and being the driver of innovation and investment. But at the same time, I know that in other countries like the US, there is far more of a culture of relying on the private sector to just go ahead and partner and make things happen, identify a problem and make things happen. So perhaps what we really need is an articulation of what are our national metric and our goals, what are our targets. It's all very hazy at the moment. We have things like the Sustainability Development Goals. We're not really even sure, like, what would be a measure of success coming out of the economy? Is it simply we go back to how things were, or do we double down on the things that we know we need to invest in to compensate for the damage that's been done and the sources of growth that have been turned off? I'd like to emphasize that it's not about austerity. I think it's about doubling down on that investment and creating a culture where we are not myopic, but we're patient enough to see it through for those gains. So I think that's multifaceted. I don't see those signs necessarily coming from the public sector. So I think it is up to the private sector to really lead that way in many respects. And then my final message would be to the students. I teach first year macroeconomics, and those students, they're really solution oriented. They want to invest in their degree, their education, so that they can do something purposeful. So they're not shying away from understanding what are the big issues and identifying where they can make a contribution, inventing their own startup or collaborating with others to develop a new product. I think we have all those ingredients in that next generation coming through. And so more opportunities for that generation to partner through internships, through cross-generational exchange of knowledges where the ideas, the vision, the passion is there, the resources are there, and existing businesses. Yes, we have researchers, but we also have a really talented stream of students coming through who aren't going to have those ordinary opportunities sitting there for them. So I think we do need to harness that and steer them into ways where they can find purpose.
Well, we've had furious agreement from our panelists on many, many things. And I think there's some insights that we've gained from the session, and I want to thank each of you particularly. Professor Sally Weller from the University of South Australia, Dr. Leonora Rees from RMIT University, but speaking to us from Queensland, as she told us, Dr. Anthea Bill from the University of Newcastle, and Dr. Aidawan Ulkan from Deakin University in Geelong. Now, we have a presentation for you from Deakin University coming up in a moment, and then in a little less than half an hour, at 2:45 East Coast time, the Treasurer of South Australia, Rob Lucas, will join us, and we have an opportunity to hear from him, but also to put some of the issues that have been raised today to him as we continue with our discussion. And you can keep the discussion going with hashtag ATN Solutions Summit on Twitter. The address is @ATN Unis, but hashtag ATN all caps Solutions Summit if you want to keep going on social media. But Rob Lucas, the South Australian Treasurer, joining us next after this presentation from Deakin University.
The Institute for Frontier Materials at Deakin University focuses on developing new materials and engineering solutions with a transformational benefit to society. IFM researchers are working on materials such as alloys and textiles, with a particular focus on designing materials for multiple lifetimes and creating materials with added functionality. We're very proud of our research culture and have spent a lot of effort setting up the structure of the Institute so that it really stimulates and facilitates collaboration. The large cafe area is normally a hive of activity where academics and students meet with industry and community visitors to discuss ideas and collaborations. We have great facilities for doing research across the size scales. Researchers investigate the structure of materials from metals to fibres at the atomic and molecular scale using our advanced atom probe and electron microscopes. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a pilot scale facility where researchers can work on industry scale problems. IFM normally has about 150 PhD students working on projects, from some that are addressing fundamental research problems to others that are very applied and involve working with an industry partner. The facilities for fibre and textile research at IFM are some of the most advanced in Australia. Under our overarching theme of designing materials for a circular economy, we work particularly on the sustainability of processing and the huge problem of textile waste. At the same time, our researchers working with industry partners are adding functionality to textiles and other fibrous materials using methods such as novel surface treatments. We work with many industry partners to deliver solutions to their research problems. In the carbon fibre space, for example, we're working with Carbon Revolution to develop materials and processes suitable for high-volume manufacturing, and with Vestas to improve the strength of carbon fibre composite materials for wind turbines. We're able to do this work thanks to our unique pilot-scale carbon fibre research facility, Carbon Nexus, where we can produce carbon fibre and address research challenges across the carbon fibre value chain. Another group at IFM is working with the Ear Science Institute of Australia to develop a membrane to repair perforated eardrums. They start with silkworm cocoons, which they convert into a transparent membrane to cover the perforated eardrum. We hope this device will go a long way towards solving the problem of hearing loss due to middle ear infection, which affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. IFM also has a large team working on energy storage solutions. A major challenge for the world is clean energy and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This will require safe and reliable energy storage. The IFM researchers, working with a number of industry partners, are looking at alternative solutions, such as sodium-ion batteries. These technologies will help enable the widespread uptake of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Much of this work is carried out at the Battery Hub, which is an advanced battery prototyping facility for upscaling and commercialising new energy storage technologies. In the hub, researchers are producing pouch cells, where multiple layers of electrodes can be stacked so they can reach energy densities that are practical for powering devices. A custom-designed robotic stacking unit is used to assemble multi-layered pouch cells capable of powering a range of small-scale electronic devices, from phones to drones. This work has real-world impact in a number of different areas. Batteries that are safer, can withstand high temperatures, and last for longer. Our pilot scale or proof of concept building is where we take ideas from the lab bench to the industrial scale. In this building, we can replicate all aspects of factory-based metal processing. We have the ability to create new alloys and treat them exactly as they would be processed in industry. We also have one of the largest flexible metal forming facilities in the world, where we can make prototype automotive components. Another key area is faster alloy development using additive manufacturing. A breakthrough additive manufacturing technology, known as MELD, was added in 2020. The new facility is the first of its kind outside the US and allows metal 3D printing without the need to melt the metal first. Textiles testing is also carried out in this building, with a large project to support a new Australasian star rating system for motorcycle protective clothing known as MotoCap. The team tests motorcycle protective clothing for a number of safety parameters, such as abrasion resistance, burst strength and impact resistance, as well as thermal comfort. At IFM, we're always looking for opportunities to expand our research and make more connections with industry and other research institutions. We also welcome inquiries from PhD and Master by Research candidates interested in joining our team. The Institute for Frontier Materials at Deakin University focuses on developing new materials and engineering solutions with a transformational benefit to society. IFM researchers are working on materials such as alloys and textiles, with a particular focus on designing materials for multiple lifetimes and creating materials with added functionality. We're very proud of our research culture and have spent a lot of effort setting up the structure of the Institute so that it really stimulates and facilitates collaboration. The large cafe area is normally a hive of activity where academics and students meet with industry and community visitors to discuss ideas and collaborations. We have great facilities for doing research across the size scales. Researchers investigate the structure of materials from metals to fibres at the atomic and molecular scale using our advanced atom probe and electron microscopes. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a pilot scale facility where researchers can work on industry scale problems. IFM normally has about 150 PhD students working on projects, from some that are addressing fundamental research problems to others that are very applied and involve working with an industry partner. The facilities for fibre and textile research at IFM are some of the most advanced in Australia. Under our overarching theme of designing materials for a circular economy, we work particularly on the sustainability of processing and the huge problem of textile waste. At the same time, our researchers working with industry partners are adding functionality to textiles and other fibrous materials using methods such as novel surface treatments. We work with many industry partners to deliver solutions to their research problems. In the carbon fibre space, for example, we're working with Carbon Revolution to develop materials and processes suitable for high-volume manufacturing, and with Vestas to improve the strength of carbon fibre composite materials for wind turbines. We're able to do this work thanks to our unique pilot-scale carbon fibre research facility, Carbon Nexus, where we can produce carbon fibre and address research challenges across the carbon fibre value chain. Another group at IFM is working with the Ear Science Institute of Australia to develop a membrane to repair perforated eardrums. They start with silkworm cocoons, which they convert into a transparent membrane to cover the perforated eardrum. We hope this device will go a long way towards solving the problem of hearing loss due to middle ear infection, which affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. IFM also has a large team working on energy storage solutions. A major challenge for the world is clean energy and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This will require safe and reliable energy storage. The IFM researchers, working with a number of industry partners, are looking at alternative solutions, such as sodium-ion batteries. These technologies will help enable the widespread uptake of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Much of this work is carried out at the Battery Hub, which is an advanced battery prototyping facility for upscaling and commercialising new energy storage technologies. In the hub, researchers are producing pouch cells, where multiple layers of electrodes can be stacked so they can reach energy densities that are practical for powering devices. A custom-designed robotic stacking unit is used to assemble multi-layered pouch cells capable of powering a range of small-scale electronic devices, from phones to drones. This work has real-world impact in a number of different areas. Batteries that are safer, can withstand high temperatures, and last for longer. Our pilot scale or proof of concept building is where we take ideas from the lab bench to the industrial scale. In this building, we can replicate all aspects of factory-based metal processing. We have the ability to create new alloys and treat them exactly as they would be processed in industry. We also have one of the largest flexible metal forming facilities in the world, where we can make prototype automotive components. Another key area is faster alloy development using additive manufacturing. A breakthrough additive manufacturing technology, known as MELD, was added in 2020. The new facility is the first of its kind outside the US and allows metal 3D printing without the need to melt the metal first. Textiles testing is also carried out in this building, with a large project to support a new Australasian star rating system for motorcycle protective clothing known as MotoCap. The team tests motorcycle protective clothing for a number of safety parameters, such as abrasion resistance, burst strength and impact resistance, as well as thermal comfort. At IFM, we're always looking for opportunities to expand our research and make more connections with industry and other research institutions. We also welcome inquiries from PhD and Master by Research candidates interested in joining our team. The Institute for Frontier Materials at Deakin University focuses on developing new materials and engineering solutions with a transformational benefit to society. IFM researchers are working on materials such as alloys and textiles, with a particular focus on designing materials for multiple lifetimes and creating materials with added functionality. We're very proud of our research culture and have spent a lot of effort setting up the structure of the Institute so that it really stimulates and facilitates collaboration. The large cafe area is normally a hive of activity where academics and students meet with industry and community visitors to discuss ideas and collaborations. We have great facilities for doing research across the size scales. Researchers investigate the structure of materials from metals to fibres at the atomic and molecular scale using our advanced atom probe and electron microscopes. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a pilot scale facility where researchers can work on industry scale problems. IFM normally has about 150 PhD students working on projects, from some that are addressing fundamental research problems to others that are very applied and involve working with an industry partner. The facilities for fibre and textile research at IFM are some of the most advanced in Australia. Under our overarching theme of designing materials for a circular economy, we work particularly on the sustainability of processing and the huge problem of textile waste. At the same time, our researchers working with industry partners are adding functionality to textiles and other fibrous materials using methods such as novel surface treatments. We work with many industry partners to deliver solutions to their research problems. In the carbon fibre space, for example, we're working with Carbon Revolution to develop materials and processes suitable for high-volume manufacturing, and with Vestas to improve the strength of carbon fibre composite materials for wind turbines. We're able to do this work thanks to our unique pilot-scale carbon fibre research facility, Carbon Nexus, where we can produce carbon fibre and address research challenges across the carbon fibre value chain. Another group at IFM is working with the Ear Science Institute of Australia to develop a membrane to repair perforated eardrums. They start with silkworm cocoons, which they convert into a transparent membrane to cover the perforated eardrum. We hope this device will go a long way towards solving the problem of hearing loss due to middle ear infection, which affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. IFM also has a large team working on energy storage solutions. A major challenge for the world is clean energy and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This will require safe and reliable energy storage. The IFM researchers, working with a number of industry partners, are looking at alternative solutions, such as sodium-ion batteries. These technologies will help enable the widespread uptake of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Much of this work is carried out at the Battery Hub, which is an advanced battery prototyping facility for upscaling and commercialising new energy storage technologies. In the hub, researchers are producing pouch cells, where multiple layers of electrodes can be stacked so they can reach energy densities that are practical for powering devices. A custom-designed robotic stacking unit is used to assemble multi-layered pouch cells capable of powering a range of small-scale electronic devices, from phones to drones. This work has real-world impact in a number of different areas. Batteries that are safer, can withstand high temperatures, and last for longer. Our pilot scale or proof of concept building is where we take ideas from the lab bench to the industrial scale. In this building, we can replicate all aspects of factory-based metal processing. We have the ability to create new alloys and treat them exactly as they would be processed in industry. We also have one of the largest flexible metal forming facilities in the world, where we can make prototype automotive components. Another key area is faster alloy development using additive manufacturing. A breakthrough additive manufacturing technology, known as MELD, was added in 2020. The new facility is the first of its kind outside the US and allows metal 3D printing without the need to melt the metal first. Textiles testing is also carried out in this building, with a large project to support a new Australasian star rating system for motorcycle protective clothing known as MotoCap. The team tests motorcycle protective clothing for a number of safety parameters, such as abrasion resistance, burst strength and impact resistance, as well as thermal comfort. At IFM, we're always looking for opportunities to expand our research and make more connections with industry and other research institutions. We also welcome inquiries from PhD and Master by Research candidates interested in joining our team.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us for the ATN Solutions Summit, final session for day one. I'm John Fain, for those of you joining us for the first time, and in a moment we'll hear from Rob Lucas, the Treasurer in the South Australian Liberal Government. Tomorrow, I remind you that we kick off at 12 o'clock East Coast time, and we hear today, after hearing from the government this morning, we'll hear from the opposition tomorrow with Richard Martin. And at the same time on Wednesday, we'll hear from Christopher Pine as our first speaker. And there's panels on all sorts of diverse things, including tomorrow we'll have a panel discussion about some of the great success stories, some of the people who have done the work we're talking about of collaborating between industry and universities, and they'll give us some ideas on what works and how to do it. But without any further delay, I'd like to welcome to our discussion a man who surely is Australia's longest serving Member of Parliament, elected in 1982. That's right, 1982, before I'm sure some of you were even born. Rob Lucas is the Treasurer in the South Australian Marshall Liberal Government, and he joins us from Adelaide, and we're very much looking forward to learning what he sees as some of the challenges and opportunities that present to universities and industry in improving collaboration. And Treasurer, thank you very much for giving us your time this afternoon. And we have to mute your microphone and then we'll get started and we'll hear from the Treasurer from South Australia. Rob Lucas, your time starts now.
Okay, thank you. My apologies for that. Look, John, thank you
very
much.
We might just, before you start, we might just get your camera adjusted. We're only seeing some of you. We'd like to see all of you. Maybe your chair goes up a bit, or you can sit on an opposition shadow minister or something like that in order to lift you up a little higher.
That's about as high as I go.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Look, thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to participate in this. The one advantage of Zoom conferences is that I can't see the number of people my contributions put to sleep. So I'm delighted to make a presentation and then, as I understand it, briefly respond to any questions that you might have on behalf of the other attendees. I've been asked to speak briefly on South Australia's economic perspective and economic growth and jobs of the future. I guess in summary, 3 points I'd make. One is as with all governments, as we're emerging from COVID, we're all utilising massive economic stimulus packages. Our government's contribution to that is a $4 billion economic stimulus package over the next 2 years. And I won't go through the detail of that. That's available on various government websites. As we look to growth for the future and jobs for the future, we're very much about wanting to support significant population growth in South Australia. We've traditionally grown at half the national population growth rate for Australia, and we're therefore willingly indicating to the Commonwealth Government that whatever the national migration intake is, we're quite happy in South Australia to take a bigger share of that migration intake, as New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland indicate their intention to take a smaller share in the future of that migration intake. I guess the third overarching narrative we've got in relation to economic growth and our jobs for the future in South Australia has been very much about being a small regional economy. The only way we believe we can see our economy grow and grow at a national rate or better, and jobs growth to grow at a national rate or better, is that the costs of doing business in our state have to be nationally and internationally competitive. If we want our businesses to compete nationally and internationally by selling goods and services in those markets, the costs of doing business in the state have to be nationally and internationally competitive. And to that end, in quick summary, stamp duty on commercial property transactions have been abolished, significant land tax reform, so the top land tax rates dropped from 3.7 to 2.4%. Payroll tax initiatives such as abolition of all payroll tax for all small businesses under $1.5 million payrolls, significant water cost reductions. I won't go into the detail of those. And we are progressing quickly to the path of reducing what has been the jobs killer in South Australia, which has been the cost of electricity. And we see the interconnector through to the eastern states through the Riverland of South Australia, our second interconnector, as being one of the final pieces in that jigsaw puzzle in terms of driving down the cost of doing business in the state. So in terms of, as I said, jobs growth and economic growth for the future, they're the overarching imperatives for us as a state and a state government. In relation to the sorts of areas of greater interest to your conference today in terms of jobs of the future, clearly we see South Australia as having a couple of very significant advantages. Clearly we're looking to make it a cost competitive state, but we also believe we're a very livable state in terms of the cost of housing and the cost of commercial leasing space in South Australia, etc., and the general livability of Adelaide as a city and South Australia as a state. But to that end, and in addition to that, we're seeing, we believe, with the massive bipartisan commitment at the national level to defence and shipbuilding in South Australia, a $90 billion plus, I'm sure the number will be bigger as we get further into the program, but over the next 40 to 50 years in terms of defence and shipbuilding projects in South Australia. As I said, importantly, we're not going to suffer the peaks and troughs that we've seen in the past in terms of defence and shipbuilding. There's a commitment from both the current government and the alternative government at the national level to that level of ongoing expenditure. So people can invest in defence, shipbuilding and allied industries. And to that end, the success of attracting the Space Agency here in South Australia, located at Lot 14, there's a fair degree of complementarity between many of the businesses and industries in defence, shipbuilding, space, cyber security, right across the board. And so the government is very much seeing that sort of federal commitment to our state, and also the state commitment and private sector investment that we're seeing as being one of the key growth prospects for industry sectors for growth in South Australia over the coming decades. We see down at Lot 14 as just one example where we've got not only the location of the Space Agency, but we've got the Cyber Collaboration Centre, which has been established down there. We've got the Institute of Machine Learning, which is being established at Lot 14. For those who don't know Adelaide, Lot 14 is on North Terrace on the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site. Amazon and Google, with very small presences, admittedly, but we're hoping to see them grow over the coming years together with Accenture and the South Australian homegrown companies, which are well known, I'm sure, to many of your audience, Myriota, Innovor, and a variety of other what used to be startups and now growing and growing rapidly, all in and around that Lot 14 precinct on North Terrace. We're working collaboratively with the Space Agency, with defence departments, universities, and as I said, private sector investment through either startups or others that are growing and growing quickly in that particular area. I guess the final point, given we have a short time for me to speak today, is as a result of that, there's a huge demand for skills and skilled people in this particular sector and these growing sectors in South Australia. We see a big commitment from the Commonwealth Government and the state government in the national skills agreements, and we're about to go through a revision, a national partnership agreement from the Commonwealth Government and all the state and territory governments. And in South Australia, one of our key foci will be clearly defence and defence-related industries in South Australia. And that's going to require, it is already involving, I should say, our 3 universities in South Australia. It's involving our TAFE, it's involving private vocational education training providers, together with, particularly at the upper level of our schooling system in South Australia. So there's the early estimates are at least 4,000 extra jobs directly in defence and shipbuilding and space, but then many thousands of other, obviously, indirect jobs as a result of huge investment. And we're going to need trained people. We're already seeing, John, and your listeners or your participants, the defence industry already picking the eyes out, if I can use that unfortunate phrase, of the best of the young people from our professional services companies in South Australia, lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, project managers, engineers, and paying them significantly more than they're currently earning. And so we're going to see significant demand, not only in the specifically trained people for defence and shipbuilding, but in those broad skills in engineering and the law and project management in South Australia, which will work up through some of the professional service companies, and then will eventually, the best of them will be picked out by the defence primes, and some will be employed directly by the defence primes. But we're going to have a huge demand, which we've identified, but we're going to need to work together with the universities and, as I said, the other training providers to try and meet the huge demand that we're going to have for jobs in this particular sector. Last point quickly, and then I'll hand over to you, John, and thank you for allowing me to participate. One of the post-COVID advantages that we're seeing in South Australia nationally, I think, is a recognition from the national government, state governments, of sovereign capacity in certain industry sectors. And whilst it's very topical at the moment, the steel industry and Whyalla Steelworks is a critical example of that. And I think there's a recognition at the national level. I know there's a recognition at the national level from the Prime Minister downwards. There's certainly a recognition at the state level from the Premier downwards that the sovereign capacity for our nation post-COVID in important industry sectors like steel industry production, and Whyalla is a critical component of Australia's sovereign capacity, is something that national and state governments are going to have to work together to ensure that whatever the particular makeup of the providers might be, that we continue to maintain that sovereign capacity. Right. And that's going to require considerable skill uptake in a number of areas as we look at green steel, green hydrogen and the like, all of those related exciting prospects for the future. So John, with that, thank you for allowing me to contribute.
Thank you, Treasurer. A couple of quick things. The federal government quite notably refused to provide JobKeeper relief to university staff. How many people were let go by universities in South Australia, and how much of an opportunity missed was that?
Well, look, I can't give you the exact number, and your university members are probably best placed to do it. But what I've got to say is in South Australia, and I'm not sure whether that's true nationally, our university sector responded pretty strongly. Without individualising those universities, one of the universities' financial statements for the last year was pretty impressive in terms of managing the challenges of COVID. Now, particularly those universities which were more exposed to international education will have had their income and balance sheets impacted more significantly than others. But certainly our universities in South Australia have and continue to have strong balance sheets, and they managed to cope with all of the challenges of COVID, whether or not they got JobKeeper or not. And I think our universities in South Australia are well placed post-COVID, as we emerge from COVID, to meet the challenges of the future.
All right. Now, one of the great competitions between states is going to be for the skills that you acknowledged were now in short supply. And what we're seeing already is a bit like an arms race where everybody is competing for the same thing to overcome the capacity constraints. What does South Australia offer, and how do you match it with, in particular, the wealthier, deeper pockets of Victoria and New South Wales?
Well, there's no better place to live than Adelaide in South Australia, John. So that's you know, a statement of fact. You can sell a home in Sydney and buy a suburb in Adelaide. So the advantages that people are seeing as they've had to come back to Adelaide, particularly those who've left, and we acknowledge that for job prospects, a number of those will go back to the bigger centres of Sydney and Melbourne. We are seeing net interstate migration figures certainly emerging in a positive fashion, where they've been negative significantly for the last decade or so. Look, clearly, if you want a job in, and we're seeing this already in defence shipbuilding space, there is no better place for the jobs of the future than in South Australia. So whilst Melbourne and Sydney might have deeper pockets, the space agencies in South Australia, the $90 billion commitment over the next 40 to 50 years in building ships and submarines is in South Australia. So there's not much point in getting a job in Melbourne or Sydney, with great respect, if you want to get a job in these exciting jobs of the future in these areas. And the Premier is trying to position Jobs 14, and so is the state government, not just the Premier, Lot 14, space, as being a centre for cyber security as well. We see this as a huge challenge for the future for all of us, but we also see it as an exciting jobs growth sector, and we're wanting to develop the expertise with the Cyber Collaboration Centre, the Space Agency, and various other companies and startups that we've got at Lot 14 in the cyber security sector.
All right, and if I can be greedy and squeeze one more in, we've seen climate change and energy policy paralysis at the national level. There's no other way to describe it. Your state has been outstanding as a leader in developing the application of new technologies, and obviously I'm talking about the big battery. What hope is there that South Australia's leadership on that particular area of gridlock will be mimicked and followed, and we can end this national policy dead end?
Well, I think you're right to identify that South Australia has been a national leader, and a part of that is going to be, in terms of the stability of the electricity market, is going to be, we've got bucket loads of renewable energy which we can export, but we only have one pipe to export it at the moment through Victoria. That's why the interconnector through the Riverland is critical for national security in terms of both price and stability of the national electricity market. We see that as being critical. But look, we're willing participants in national debates, John, in terms of climate change. We've committed to the emissions targets in South Australia, but we're a small state, we acknowledge that. But we're willing participants in the national debate, and we'll do our bit to try and assist some sort of national consensus in this vexed area, complex area, which has been for a decade or more at the national level.
And what's the secret to longevity in politics?
Well, let me assure you, in 12 months' time, I'll find out. I think it's been about 25 years in opposition. Most of my period of time has been in opposition. I've the great fortune of having the last 4 years in government, and I've already announced my political mortality in 12 months' time in March next year. So this will be the last occasion I have to join with you and your colleagues on this particular occasion.
Well, congratulations on an extraordinary career and a contribution of service to the South Australian people. And if the battery lasts as long as your political career, then the people of South Australia will be doubly well served. Thank you for your time today.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. The Treasurer from South Australia from the Marshall Liberal Government, Rob Lucas. Now, Luke Shee from ATN joins just a quick couple of minutes wrap of where we've been today. And just a reminder that on Twitter, it's hashtag ATN Solutions Summit. And our session tomorrow kicks off with Richard Marles. Today we heard from the Minister. From Alan Tudge tomorrow, we hear from the Shadow Minister, Richard Marles, as we head towards sometime in the next 12 months, probably, almost certainly a federal election. So, Luke, today, takeaways from that as we close up today's session and look towards tomorrow.
Thanks, John, and thank you for leading the discussion so ably today. It's been fantastic. And a big shout out as well to Twig Marketing, our regional Victorian small business, helping us out with the broadcast based in Shepparton. So it's good that we're supporting regional businesses today. I just thought it was really interesting. We've had a range of discussions that focused on what are the component parts that we need to drive a new innovation future for Australia that will then lead to jobs and will lead to opportunity and secure jobs for Australians. And of course, leading off with the treasure at the end, South Australia is a beneficiary of some clear policy signals. They've got clear industry policy signals from the Commonwealth and the state government working in collaboration with their skills, universities and private sectors, and of course the pipeline then as well for small to medium enterprises. I think a desire to have a clarity around industry policy and skills policy and the nexus between skills, industry, R&D and developing new industries was raised by a number of panellists, and I'm thinking Roy Green, I'm thinking Ines Willicks. Of course, we'd looked at some of the issues that we would like to cover off as a society and an economy in building back after COVID, which includes developing new industries to give secure work, look after segments of the economy like women's participation, women's economic security. So I think there's been a really broad range discussion today, John, a lot of issues of what we should do to address it. I think tomorrow is going to be really interesting because we're going to look at some of the areas where our universities in particular have already had some levels of success that's led to those new industries emerging, new jobs, tapping into the global supply chains, etc. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. But I think today reminded me that it is a triangular effort, you know, between industry, between universities and of course government. And when you can get that clarity, particularly like they do in South Australia, wonderful things can happen. And of course, I'm really tempted now to sail up on the East Coast and move to South Australia. I think Adelaide is a marvellous town. I say that as a native Melburnian, but Rob Lucas made a very attractive offer there. And I think that's the kind of, you know, that's the kind of city and state I'd like to live in, where there's opportunities coming from that policy clarity and that collaboration.
I can see your imperial ambitions to own an entire sub in Adelaide. They're coming to the fore there, Luke, and we'll see some more of those imperial ambitions undoubtedly when you join us, as well as a guiding hand through tomorrow's session. So on behalf of the ATN, the Australian Technology Network of Universities, that's Curtin, Deakin, RMIT, Uni South Australia, UTS in Sydney, and in collaboration with the University of Newcastle. Thank you for your contributions today. Look forward to resuming and seeing you all again tomorrow. Good day.